Chapter 2630. In the fierce battle between the two Ancestor Realm experts, it was clear that Jun Wuya's combat strength was inferior to Xie Tian's. After all, Jun Wuya did not have the talent and luck of Shao Chun, and he did not have the help of those old fellows in the Origin World. Therefore, Jun Wuya's combat strength could only be considered the most ordinary in the Ancestor Realm. However, Shao Chun and Xie Tian were not like this. Because of their different reasons, their combat strength was at the peak of the same realm. After exchanging several hundred moves, Jun Wuya fell into a disadvantage as expected. Xie Tian also seized this opportunity to suppress Jun Wuya. Moreover, there was a cold smile on his face as he said, "Jun Wuya, you are not this lord's match. So what? Do you dare to fight me?" Hearing this, Jun Wuya replied indifferently. These words were indeed to the point. Was Xie Tian stronger than Jun Wuya? This was certain, but did he dare to fight Jun Wuya? The answer was certain, so naturally he did not dare. Xie Tian was confident in taking down Jun Wuya in a one-on-one battle. But what about Shao Chun? Although Shao Chun had not appeared yet, could you guarantee that Shao Chun would not make a move? Have you ever seen a wild beast that could guarantee that it would not bite? Therefore, when he heard Jun Wuya's words, Xie Tian's face sunk, and he did not speak. Although Xie Tian had already guessed why Shao Chun did not personally make a move. In the Sword Sect, Shao Chun had said that he had reached a critical moment in his closed-door cultivation and could not come out for the time being, so Jun Wuya was making a move. But would Xie Tian believe these words? He had already realized that he was being used. Shao Chun wanted to kill with a borrowed knife, and he, Xie Tian, was that knife. However, Xie Tian could not do anything about this and could only helplessly act as the knife in Shao Chun's hand. However, this blade of his was not completely infallible. Once Shao Chun changed his mind and made a move, Xie Tian would be caught off guard and would be in great danger. So, Jun Wuya had nothing to fear and Xie Tian had no other choice. Others say that your sword sect is open and honest, but in my eyes, it's only this. You've been forced into a corner with different methods. With a cold snort, Xie Tian cursed. Regarding this, Jun Wuya did not reply and continued to fight with Xie Tian. Below, Dao Xiong and the others arranged for people to treat the injured Saber Sect disciples while watching the fierce battle in the sky. Actually, Dao Xiong no longer cared about the outcome of this battle because it was impossible for the Sword Sect to lose. What Dao Xiong was most concerned about now was the Sword Sect's future. Also, what about the other Ling Tian sects besides the Sword Sect? The Sword Sect would definitely not let them off. What would come sooner or later, and the Sword Sect's blade had finally come down on them. In fact, the era of the 10 great Ling Tian sects had long passed. It was just that some of the old and stubborn ones refused to accept this fact. The reason why the Swords Gate had never really taken action was probably because they did not want to be implicated too much. And now, the time was right, and Xie Tian was the best person to wield the blade, so the Sword Sect used Xie Tian. With this slash, it meant that the era of the 10 Ling Tian sects had come to an end. The current battle in Dao Xiong's eyes was just a formality, and there wouldn't be any real results. Just wait and see. Not long after, Xie Tian would definitely take the initiative to retreat. Dao Xiong already had an answer in his heart. Inside the Sword Sect, Shao Chun and Xianyuan Ling were still sitting across from each other. They were leisurely drinking tea while chatting. Master should have already started fighting with Xie Tian, right? After drinking a mouthful of tea, Shao Chun asked in a soft voice. 29 Gigi hearing this, Xianyuan Ling said with a faint smile, "It should be. What if Xie Tian doesn't retreat?" Hearing this, Shao Chun continued to ask. He knew that Jun Wuya was not as strong as Xie Tian. Shao Chun was certain of this because Shao Chun's current strength was about the same as Xie Tian's. Using his own strength to compare with Jun Wuya's strength, he would naturally be able to get the result. Shao Chun was a little worried about Jun Wuya. Regarding this, Xianyuan Ling said confidently, "He won't. If he doesn't retreat, then it's the same to take care of him first." Xie Tian was not a fool. It was impossible for him not to retreat. Even if he didn't retreat, they would just kill him. Although killing Xietian would mean that the blade would be gone, without the threat of Xietian, Xin Yuanling had many other methods to completely end the 10 Ling Tian sects. To put it bluntly, compared to Xietian, the Ling Tian sects like the Blade sect were easier to deal with. Xin Yuanling had 100 methods to achieve his goal. Hearing Xin Yuanling's words, Xiao Chen nodded. Thinking about it, it was impossible for Xietian not to retreat. Both of them were very confident. As for the Blade sect side, it was as planned. After a fierce battle, Xietian finally chose to retreat. In the end, Xietian had already taken the advantage. If they continued fighting, the final victor would definitely be Xietian. However, Xietian still chose to retreat. It was exactly like what they said. Would Xietian dare to fight with Junwuya? Xietian retreated, but Junwuya did not have a happy expression on his face. This was because this kind of victory was within his expectations. Secondly, to be more accurate, this was not a victory at all. Seeing Xietian escape with his people, Junwuya did not give the order to chase after them. Instead, he allowed Xietian's group to leave. When Xietian's group disappeared, Junwuya slowly descended and arrived in front of Daoxiong. The two of them could be considered old friends. They had known each other since they were young. Seeing Junwuya, who was now the ancestor of the Sword Sect and an Ancestor Realm expert, Daoxiong sighed. Not long ago, he and Junwuya were giants on equal footing. But now, facing Junwuya, Daoxiong could only sigh. He could no longer be compared to him. Seeing Daoxiong's complicated expression, Junwuya did not say anything because he did not know what to say. This time, the Sword Sect had indeed schemed against the Blade Sect. Otherwise, the Blade Sect would not have suffered such a large loss. The two of them looked at each other for a long time. In the end, it was Daoxiong who broke the silence first. Let's go. As he spoke, he took the lead and walked forward. The two of them slowly walked along the path inside the Blade Sect. They did not speak along the way. After a while, Daoxiong finally spoke. Actually, I've already guessed that this day would come. Since the day the Sword Sect rose, I knew that the 10 Great Ling Tian sects would become history. There was not much hatred in Daoxiong's words. He knew very well why the Sword Sect did this. Since an overlord had already appeared, could it be that they could still keep the other overlords from the old era? Hearing this, Junwuya glanced at him indifferently and said, "It's inevitable to allow others to sleep soundly beside one's bed. I hope you can understand." Chapter 26:31. Junwuya said calmly. Although Junwuya did not want to do this, he did not blame Xin Yuanling like Nangongwan did, because from the perspective of the Sword Sect and Shao Chun, Xin Yuanling was not wrong. His starting point was for the sake of the Sword Sect and Shao Chun. The Sword Sect would not allow any threats. This was inevitable. In the current great wide world, other than Xietian, only the Lingtian sects like the Saber Sect could threaten the Sword Sect. This threat was not because the Saber Sect and the other sects were strong, but because of their influence and rallying power, as well as the changes in the era. To be honest, even if the Lingtian sects like the Saber Sect and the other Lingtian sects worked together, they would not be a match for the Sword Sect. However, they were an old force in the great wide world and were once one of the top 10 Lingtian sects. Their influence could not be ignored. Moreover, the Sword Sect could be said to be on the same level as the Saber Sect and the other Lingtian sects. There was even a period of time when they were not as strong as the Saber Sect and the other Lingtian sects. In this way, what was the Saber Sect's existence to the Sword Sect? Was it a kind of humiliation? Was it a kind of testimony to the decline of the Sword Sect? Therefore, no matter how one looked at it, after the Sword Sect became the only overlord of the great wide world, the Saber Sect and the other Lingtian sects could not continue to exist. There was no reason for them to continue to exist. This was like the change of a dynasty. With the emergence of a new dynasty, would the emperor and members of the royal family of the old dynasty be left behind? Obviously, it was impossible. In the eyes of the Sword Sect, the top 10 Lingtian sects were the kings of the old era. Now that the new era had arrived, the kings of the old era could only retire. How could they stand on the same stage as the new kings? If one were to talk about whether Dao Xiong was angry or resentful, there would definitely be some. However, if one were to talk about hatred, to be honest, Dao Xiong did not have much hatred. If one were to think about it from another perspective, if the Saber sect was the one in power now, the Sword sect would end up in the same way. Dao Xiong might even be more decisive. Compared to a bloody massacre, the Sword sect's method was gentle enough. Moreover, the Sword sect did not destroy the Saber sect. Although they had schemed, they had acted in time to save the Sword sect. And the Sword sect. They arrived at the side of a spirit lake and sat down. Dao Xiong looked at Jun Wuya and said with a light smile, "Then, how does your precious disciple intend to deal with the Saber sect and me?" To the Sword sect, Dao Xiong's identity was the most awkward. Jun Wuya looked deeply at Dao Xiong and said slowly, "The Saber sect is disbanded. Those who are willing to join the Sword sect can be taken over by the Sword sect. Those who are unwilling will be dismissed on the spot. As for you, you have two choices. One is to live a carefree life and ignore the affairs of the world. The second is to join the Sword sect and become an ancestor of the Sword sect like me. You don't have to care about anything on normal days. You only have to protect the Sword sect when you're needed." Dao Xiong smiled when he heard Jun Wuya's words. This was already considered an extra kindness from Xiao Chun and Jun Wuya. After all, with his identity, the best way to solve this problem was naturally to end it once and for all. It would save him a lot of trouble if he killed them directly. However, the Sword sect gave him two choices. Moreover, no matter which choice he chose, it was not a bad outcome for Dao Xiong. In fact, the second choice was to join the Sword sect and become an ancestor. His status was almost the same as Jun Wuya's. At least on the surface, it was enough to give him status and face. Dao Xiong could naturally guess that the reason for this was probably because Jun Wuya and Xiao Chun remembered their old friendship. In fact, this was indeed the case. If they followed Xian Yuanling's wishes, Dao Xiong and the others would definitely be killed. After all, dead people were the safest. However, Xiao Chun strongly opposed it. Xian Yuanling wanted to abolish the former Lingtian sect. Xiao Chun could accept this and had no objections. However, Xiao Chun was not willing to kill Dao Xiong and the others. Of course, Jun Wuya was not willing to do so either. This was especially true for Dao Xiong, Luo Xing, and Dan Xingyang, who had always been on good terms with the Sword sect. Xian Shuba. The resentment in his heart dissipated a little. When he saw the smile on Dao Xiong's face, although it looked bitter, it at least showed that the resentment in his heart was gradually dissipating. Jun Wuya continued, "From a personal standpoint, I hope that you can join the Sword sect. That way, you'll have a chance to break through to the progenitor realm. Besides, moreover, the Sword Gate will be more at ease. After all, it's right under their noses, right?" Hearing Jun Wuya's words, Dao Xiong interrupted him before he could finish. The Sword sect naturally hoped that Dao Xiong would choose the second path. After all, compared to becoming a rogue cultivator, becoming a patriarch of the Sword sect would make Xiao Chun feel more at ease. To put it bluntly, it meant that he would be placed under house arrest and monitored. Jun Wuya did not refute Dao Xiong's words. He calmly waited for Dao Xiong to continue. Seeing Jun Wuya's reaction, Dao Xiong knew that he was right. He stood up, turned his head to look at the grass and trees around him, and softly muttered to himself, "I founded the Sword sect single-handedly. I've lived here for so many years. I watched it grow step by step, watched it grow stronger, and now it's declining step by step. To be honest, it's like I'm looking at my own child. I'm filled with reluctance." He was reluctant because the Sword sect was his life's work. However, it was destroyed just like that without any ability to resist. Everything before him, including the grass and trees, was so intimate to Dao Xiong. However, from today onwards, the Sword sect would no longer exist in the Great Thousand World. Hearing Dao Xiong sigh, Jun Wuya did not say anything. He only listened quietly. After saying a lot, he revealed all the reluctance in his heart. In the end, Dao Xiong looked at Jun Wuya and said, "All right, I'll go back to the Sword sect." All right, I'll follow you back to the Sword Gate. However, if these disciples of the Saber sect are unwilling, I hope that the Sword Gate will be lenient. Of course. Hearing this, Jun Wuya happily nodded and agreed. In the end, Dao Xiong chose the second path, which was to join the Sword sect and become a patriarch in name only. He had the title of a patriarch, but he did not have any real power. In other words, he was just like a mascot. On the way back, perhaps because he had thought things through, or perhaps because he had completely given up, Dao Xiong gave off a much more carefree feeling. Even his cultivation had loosened. Sensing this, Dao Xiong was stunned. Jun Wuya smiled bitterly and said, "Is this the end of the bitterness for you? Haha, it's not really the end of the bitterness. Cultivation is the cultivation of the heart. In the past, I had too many worries. Now that I've let go, I'll naturally have some comprehension. Just like you, you've been idle your entire life. That's why your cultivation is always ahead of mine." Chapter 2632. His cultivation base, which had remained stagnant for many years without showing any signs of nervousness, actually showed some signs of loosening at this moment. Although it was only a little, it was enough to make an expert at Dao Xiong's level excited. After all, every little bit of improvement was extremely difficult. His cultivation base, which had remained stagnant for many years without showing any signs of nervousness, actually showed some signs of loosening at this moment. Although it was only a little, it was enough to make an expert at Dao Xiong's level excited. After all, every little bit of improvement was extremely difficult. However, Dao Xiong was not in such a good mood right now. Instead, he was somewhat self-deprecating. Indeed, it was undeniable that letting go of some things in one's heart was indeed helpful for the improvement of one's cultivation base. In response, Jun Wuya only smiled and said nothing. Dao Xiong had no choice but to follow the Sword Sect's instructions and deal with the Saber Sect's matter. Jun Wuya remained in the Saber Sect for the time being to assist with the Saber Sect's matters. That day, Dao Xiong had already informed the higher-ups of the Saber Sect of the matter. Of course, Dao Xiong did not say that the Sword Sect had forced them to do so. Instead, he put all the blame on himself and analyzed many things for everyone. Everyone, this old man has decided to disband the Saber Sect. Times have changed, and it is no longer the same as it was back then. This old man also intends to let the Saber Sect's disciples join the Sword Sect. Of course, this old man will also become the patriarch of the Sword Sect. After hearing Dao Xiong's words, the upper echelons of the Saber Sect were naturally no fools. At the very least, they were able to guess what exactly had happened. However, no one pointed it out. Just as Dao Xiong had said, the current era was no longer the same as before. The disappearance of the Saber Sect was inevitable from the very beginning. With Jun Wuya personally overseeing the situation, nothing would happen. The higher-ups of the Saber Sect did not dare to do anything out of line. On the other side, after the dust had settled on the Saber Sect, Xin Yuanling also sent people to the Dan Valley, Moon Palace, and other Lingtian sects. The Saber Sect was just a breakthrough. Next, Xin Yuanling would have to face people from other Lingtian sects. Inviting them to the Sword Sect was to put an end to the old era. The experts of the Sword Sect came knocking on the door one after another. The Moon Palace's experts were fine, as they had also guessed the intentions of the Sword Sect. Luo Xing and Xiao Xiao were not too opposed to this. After meeting with the Sword Sect's emissary, Luo Xing looked at Xiao Xiao, who stood before her, and said softly, "It seems the Sword Sect has taken action. Boundless should be in the Saber Sect right now." Yes, according to the news, the Saber Sect has already decided to disband. Many of the Saber Sect's experts have chosen to join the Sword Sect. Hearing this, Xiao Xiao replied with a calm expression. Luo Xing wasn't against joining the Sword's Gate. In fact, she was looking forward to it because she would be able to spend time with Jun Wuya in the future. Liking Jun Wuya for a lifetime had always been Luo Xing's dream. Therefore, without much hesitation, Luo Xing had already made her choice. It was impossible. In addition, Luo Xing was also interested in joining the Sword Sect. Naturally, the Moon Palace would follow suit. However, everything would have to wait until they joined the Sword Sect. However, the other factions, such as Dan Valley and the Heavenly Policy Palace, were somewhat hesitant. These two factions had also received news from the Saber Sect. They knew the current situation of the Saber Sect and the attitude of the Sword Sect. To be honest, they were somewhat opposed to disbanding or joining the Sword Sect. However, there was nothing they could do. In Dan Valley, Dan Xingyang looked at the distant sky and sighed faintly. 77 book, what will come will come. This day can't be avoided. Dan Xin stood quietly behind Dan Xingyang. As soon as he finished speaking, Dan Xingyang turned to look at Dan Xin and asked, Dan Xin, do you hate the Sword Sect? Logically speaking, the Sword Sect wanted to annex the Dan Valley. To put it bluntly, they wanted to destroy the Dan Valley. Dan Xin and Dan Xingyang should hate the Sword Sect. However, after hearing Dan Xingyang's words, Dan Xin replied with a calm expression. Like I said before, what will come will come. We can't avoid it. This is inevitable, isn't it? We've been prepared for it. Since they had already guessed that such a day would come, there was nothing they couldn't let go of now. Times had changed. The disappearance of the Dan Valley was a decision of history. Just like in the long river of time in the great wide world, many factions like the Dan Valley had been destroyed and drowned in the long river of time. Now it was just the Dan Valley's turn. Hearing Dan Xion's words, Dan Xingyang didn't say anything else. He knew that the Sword Sect's messenger this time was inviting Dan Xingyang and the others to the Sword Sect to discuss the matter of Xietian. But in reality, they were talking about the various large powers merging into the Sword Sect. As for the reason, Dan Xingyang had already guessed it. It was because they were facing a great enemy, and in order to deal with Xietian, everyone should work together. In order to better command, the suggestion was for the Dan Valley, the Heavenly Plan Palace, the Moon Palace, and the other large powers to temporarily merge into the Sword Sect. As for the disciples under them, they would temporarily be treated as disciples of the Sword Sect. Only, the word temporarily was a lie. Once they were merged into the Sword Sect, it would be impossible to separate them. Of course, they could reject them, but the Sword Sect was clearly trying peaceful means before resorting to force. Once they rejected them, they would be mercilessly killed by the Sword Sect. As for the reason, if the Sword Sect wanted to destroy a power, did they still need a reason? They could just find an excuse. If they wanted to condemn someone, they could always find a pretext. Dan Xingyang had guessed everything, but he had no way of stopping them. The other powers were also the same. But if one had to say who was the most oppressed right now, it was without a doubt Xietian. After leaving the Sword Sect, Xietian had led people to attack a medium-sized power and temporarily used it as a shelter. At this time, night had fallen and Xietian was sitting alone in his cave with a cold expression. Thinking about how he had been used by the Sword Sect, Xietian had a stomach full of anger. What did this count for? They didn't care about him at all? Before destroying him, they still wanted to squeeze out the last bit of value from him? Feeling a strong sense of contempt, the cold glow in Xietian's eyes became stronger. At the same time, he said through gritted teeth, Shao Chun, don't be too arrogant. There will be a day when I will make you regret this. Knowing that he had been used and not being able to resist, this was a fact that Xietian found hard to accept. At this time, Xietian was already thinking of how to take revenge on the Sword Sect. After a while, Xietian's eyes filled with killing intent, and he disappeared on the spot. No one knew where Xietian went, but it was definitely related to taking revenge on the Sword Sect. It was impossible for him to swallow this loss. Since your Sword Sect want me to be the blade in your hands, then don't blame this blade for biting back at its master. Xietian wanted the Sword Sect to make a fool of themselves. Perhaps he couldn't let the Sword Sect's plan go smoothly, but he had to at least cause trouble for Shao Chun. Chapter 2633. That night, Xietian left alone and no one knew where he went. In the Sword Sect, Xin Yuanling, who had just left Shao Chen's place, returned to his cave residence and was served a cup of tea by a maid. Xin Yuanling had his hands behind his back as he looked at the bright moon in the sky. That night, Xietian left alone and no one knew where he went. In the sword sect, Xianyuan Ling, who had just left Xiao Chen's place, returned to his cave residence and was served a cup of tea by a maid. Xianyuan Ling had his hands behind his back as he looked at the bright moon in the sky. It should be about time. Xianyuan Ling's words were very strange. On the other side, the Heavenly Policy Palace was also hesitating because of the saber-sex matter, and Li Xiao was in a dilemma. Speaking of Li Xiao and Jun Wuya, Luo Xing's relationship was very complicated. Li Xiao and Jun Wuya were rivals in love. Li Xiao had always liked Luo Xing, but Luo Xing liked Jun Wuya. Although Li Xiao gradually let go of his feelings and even had a good relationship with Jun Wuya, Li Xiao was still a little conflicted if the Heavenly Policy Palace was to merge with the Sword Sect. Wouldn't that mean that he was under Jun Wuya? Merging with his rival in love was something that no man would be willing to accept. Although it had happened many years ago, there were some things that couldn't be forgotten just because one wanted to. Sitting alone in his cave residence, Li Xiao was very hesitant. Moreover, the people from the Sword Sect had already made it very clear that in a few days, all the great Emperor Realm Masters would gather in the Sword Sect. At that time, he would have to give an answer. If he refused, the Sword Sect wouldn't be so easy to talk to and would definitely take action. With the current strength of the Sword Sect, it wouldn't be too difficult for them to deal with the Heavenly Policy Palace. Li Xiao had a feeling that Jun Wuya was better than him. Thinking back to the past, Li Xiao tragically realized that from the beginning, he had been suppressed by Jun Wuya in every aspect. Whether it was in terms of cultivation talent, cultivation realm, or even women, Jun Wuya had always firmly suppressed him. As for Li Xiao, it was as if he had been living under Jun Wuya's shadow. Once, for the sake of Luo Xing, Li Xiao had challenged Jun Wuya, but he had lost miserably. At the same time, he had also tried to move Luo Xing with his true feelings, but he had also lost miserably. As for Jun Wuya, he didn't do anything, and he had already made Luo Xing fall head over heels for him. Moreover, after so many years, Luo Xing's feelings for Jun Wuya hadn't changed at all. They were still as strong as before. Compared to Jun Wuya, Li Xiao felt that he was nothing. Giving a sigh, Li Xiao was currently a loss and didn't know what choice he should make. But at this moment, Li Xiao's face that had been filled with disappointment suddenly sunk. He turned to look at the darkness behind him and angrily shouted, "Who is it?" It was pitch black behind him, and he couldn't see a single person. However, as soon as Li Xiao's voice fell, a figure slowly walked out of the darkness. Seeing this figure, Li Xiao's face sunk and his voice became incomparably serious as he said, "Xie Tian." The person who came was no one else but Xie Tian. He never thought that Xie Tian would appear here. In response, Xie Tian said with a faint smile, "I never thought that the respected Heavenly Policy Palace's ancestor would have such a sentimental side. But since you hate Jun Wuya this much, how about working with me and exterminating the Sword Sect together?" It was clear that Xie Tian had seen everything just now. In response to this, Li Xiao's face sunk and he didn't say a word. Li Xiao didn't find it strange that Xie Tian would appear here. After all, Xie Tian was an Ancestor Realm expert. If he really wanted to infiltrate the Heavenly Policy Palace, it wouldn't be a difficult matter, and it would be hard for the people below to find him. Staring right at Xie Tian, Li Xiao didn't say a word. Seeing this, Xie Tian acted like he was meeting an old friend. His lips curled into a smile as he spoke in an unhurried manner. "Strange book network. How about it? Isn't my suggestion good? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Since you hate Jun Wuya this much, working with me is the best choice." Xie Tian tried to rope him in. This time, Li Xiao coldly said, "It's nothing. Working with an evil demon like you, I'm ashamed." Li Xiao rejected him without any hesitation. Xie Tian wasn't surprised by this, as if he had already guessed it would be like this. With a look of regret on his face, Xie Tian said with a sigh, "AI, it really is a pity. So you want to kill me now?" Li Xiao asked. Xie Tian appearing here, Li Xiao didn't think he was here to chat with him. Faced with Li Xiao's words, Xie Tian didn't hide anything and calmly said, "Since we can't be friends, we can only be enemies. The best way to deal with an enemy is to directly kill them." Saying this, killing intent appeared in Xie Tian's eyes. Seeing this, Li Xiao secretly raised his guard while looking for a way to escape. Naturally, he didn't think he was Xie Tian's match. The Emperor Realm and the Ancestor Realm were completely different existences and couldn't be compared at all. Noticing the change in Li Xiao's expression, Xie Tian said with a faint smile, as if everything was under his control. There's no need to think about it. The surrounding space has already been sealed by me. It's impossible for the outside world to discover anything, and you have no chance of escaping. Xie Tian had already cut off all possibility of Li Xiao escaping. As soon as he said this, Xie Tian took a step forward. His figure seemed to teleport as he directly appeared in front of Li Xiao. With such a fast speed, Li Xiao's eyes wildly jumped, but he didn't have any chance to react at all. Xie Tian's attack had already arrived, heading straight for Li Xiao's heart. At this critical moment, Li Xiao used all his strength to block it and avoided his vitals. In the end, Xie Tian's finger missed by a bit and couldn't pierce through Li Xiao's heart. Not being able to kill him with a single attack, Xie Tian said with a cold smile. Not bad, but how many moves can you last? Worthy of being a famous person, Li Xiao's combat awareness was indeed top class. But so what? It still couldn't change anything. Between the two of them, there was a gap that couldn't be crossed. If Xie Tian wanted to kill Li Xiao, it was a very simple matter. It was only a matter of time. After his attack failed, Xie Tian didn't hesitate and attacked Li Xiao again. But this time, Li Xiao wasn't so lucky and was heavily injured. Following this, although Li Xiao continued to fight to the death, in the end, the gap between the two of them was too big. Even if Li Xiao used all his strength, he still couldn't change anything. After 100 moves, Xie Tian's attack shattered Li Xiao's heart. An Emperor Realm Master, Heavenly Policy Mansion's old ancestor, died in his cave mansion just like that. His gaze began to slacken, and his body fell backwards stiffly. It was as if he had died and his Tao had vanished. Chapter 2634. Although Li Xiao had used everything he had and fought with all his strength, he had still died at Xie Tian's hands in the end. There was indeed a gap between the Emperor Realm and the Ancestor Realm that was difficult to cross. This kind of gap was not something that could be made up for by going all out. After killing Li Xiao, the smile on Xie Tian's face became even brighter. Next to Li Xiao's corpse, Xie Tian left a line of words. Those who obey will live. Those who defy will die. It was just a few simple words, but if anyone saw these words, they would immediately think of the Sword Sect. After all, the actions of the Sword Sect during this time had been seen by everyone. It was clear that the Sword Sect wanted to cleanse the entire boundless world and eliminate all those who posed a threat to them. Li Xiao was killed in such a sensitive period of time. Furthermore, there were 6 threatening words beside his corpse. Anyone would suspect Sword's Gate of being the culprit behind this. This was also Xie Tian's goal this time. He had been forced to become a blade in the hands of the Sword Sect, but Xie Tian was not willing to become a blade in the hands of others, so he had framed the Sword Sect. Moreover, Xie Tian had chosen Li Xiao as his target. It could be said that Li Xiao was the one who was most unwilling to join the Sword Sect because of his relationship with Jun Wuya and Luo Xing. Li Xiao could not be as calm as the others. Because of this, the world would believe that this was the doing of the Sword Sect. Because Li Xiao did not agree to joining the Sword Sect had made a move to kill him. First, it was to get rid of this hidden danger, and second, it was to warn others and let them make a choice. Xie Tian's idea was not bad. Once he thought of Li Xiao's corpse being found, the Sword Sect's reputation would suffer a large blow. Xie Tian couldn't help secretly feeling excited. He knew that just this matter alone was not enough to hurt the Sword Sect, but as long as it gave the Sword Sect a headache, Xie Tian was already very satisfied. Moreover, in the face of danger, the other faction's attitudes towards the Sword Sect would probably change slightly. Don't forget, even a rabbit would bite when cornered, and a corner dog would jump over a wall. In a situation where there was no way to retreat, in order to protect themselves, the major forces would probably really take the risk. Adding in the fact that Xie Tian was adding fuel to the fire from behind, Xie Tian would definitely make a move after this, making the situation even harder to control. At that time, he would be able to stir up the large world, and he, Xie Tian, will be able to fish in troubled waters. His mood was very good. Looking at Li Xiao's corpse, Xie Tian said with a faint smile, "Li Xiao, being able to do something for this one before dying is your blessing. You can go in peace." As for killing Li Xiao, Xie Tian didn't feel anything at all. It was as simple as squashing an ant. As soon as his voice fell, Xie Tian disappeared on the spot, and the restrictions around him quickly disappeared. It was like he had never been here, other than Li Xiao's corpse lying on the ground. The surroundings fell into a deathly silence as darkness covered everything. As for Li Xiao's corpse, it was silently lying on the ground without a trace of life. A silent night. That night, no one noticed anything strange with Li Xiao. Until noon of the next day, Li Chun hadn't seen Li Xiao for a long time. Feeling strange, he finally came to Li Xiao's residence. But once he came in, Li Chun saw Li Xiao's corpse, and he was stunned on the spot. When he came back to his senses, Li Chun quickly ran over to Li Xiao's side. But it was a pity that Li Xiao was already cold. His eyes were red as he picked up Li Xiao's corpse. Li Chun couldn't help crying out in pain. After that, Li Chun also saw the 6 words beside Li Xiao's corpse. "Those who obey will live. Those who defy will die." Seeing these 6 large words, Li Chun's eyes were filled with a strong hatred. It was like Xie Tian had thought. Faced with these 6 words, Li Chun's first suspicion was the sword sect. Moreover, being able to silently kill Li Xiao, perhaps only the sword sect could do this. Not long after, the high-level members of the Heavenly Plan Palace heard the news and came to Li Xiao's cave. Seeing Li Xiao's corpse, the high-level members of the Heavenly Plan Palace were filled with pain, and there were even some who were angrily cursing. Going too far, the sword sect is going too far. Could it be that they really think they can cover the sky with one hand? The palace master only hesitated for a bit, and the sword sect actually made such a vicious move. What is the meaning of this? Killing a chicken to warn the monkeys? Using our Heavenly Plan Palace to warn the other powers? We must get an explanation from the sword sect. That's right, we must get an explanation for the palace master. No matter how strong the sword sect is, they can't act so overbearingly. The high-level members of the Heavenly Plan Palace were filled with rage over Li Xiao's death. Although the Heavenly Plan Palace wasn't as strong as the sword sect, if they didn't even dare to fart when their own ancestor was killed, how could the Heavenly Plan Palace face themselves in the future? Moreover, in everyone's eyes, the sword sect's actions this time were indeed going too far. Those who obey will live. Those who defy will die. What did this mean? Could it be that as long as someone dared to go against the wishes of the sword sect, they would be killed? The high-level members were filled with righteous indignation, and Li Chun didn't say a word from beginning to end. However, the hatred in his eyes conveyed his current feelings. The Heavenly Plan Palace was furious that Li Xiao was killed. Such a big matter naturally couldn't be hidden, and the Heavenly Plan Palace clearly didn't have any intention of hiding it. If they wanted to get justice, it was impossible for them to do it alone. Therefore, many of the high-level members of the Heavenly Plan Palace began to secretly contact the Moon Palace, Dan Valley, and other forces. They wanted to get an explanation from the sword sect together. Li Xiao's death was suspected to be caused by the sword sect. When the news spread, it naturally shocked everyone. All the major forces fell into a state of shock. Among them, there were some who were doubtful, some who were suspicious, and some who felt that the sword sect had gone too far. Many forces received the news, and the sword sect naturally received the news as well. Within the sword sect, Xian Yuanling was the first person to receive the news from his residence. Looking at the elder in front of him, Xian Yuanling's expression was calm, and he didn't seem surprised at all. It was as if he already knew this would happen. After the elder finished speaking, Xian Yuanling waved his hand and said, "I understand. You may leave." Hearing this, although the elder found it strange that Xian Yuanling didn't have any reaction after hearing this, he still respectfully bowed and left the room. When the elder left, and only Xian Yuanling was left in the room, Xian Yuanling softly muttered, "As expected, They still used Li Xiao as an example. Xie Tian, you're not willing to be a knife in my hand, but you've solved a large problem for me. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2635. Xie Tian wasn't willing to become a blade in the hands of the sword sect, so he killed Li Xiao and shifted the blame to the sword sect. He wanted to create estrangement between the sword sect and the other large powers, even causing conflict to erupt. Like this, Xie Tian could wait for an opportunity to make his move. Only, Xin Yuanling had already guessed Xie Tian's actions. The reason why he didn't stop him was because Xin Yuanling wanted this result. Compared to the others, Li Xiao was the most difficult existence to deal with in Xin Yuanling's eyes. First, it was because of Li Xiao's relationship with Jun Wuya and Luo Xing. Just based on this, it was hard for Li Xiao to accept joining the sword sect. Second, it was because the sword sect couldn't directly make a move against Li Xiao and the Heavenly Plan Palace. No matter what, Li Xiao and Jun Wuya had this kind of relationship. Once the sword sect directly made a move against Li Xiao, just Jun Wuya's side wouldn't be able to explain it. A person that couldn't agree to join the sword sect and couldn't personally make a move against him, the best choice was to borrow a knife to kill him. So, even if Xin Yuanling had already guessed that Xie Tian would make a move, he didn't have any intention of stopping him. He didn't even tell anyone about his guess. Without moving, Xin Yuanling used Xie Tian again. Borrowing Xie Tian's hand, he took care of the most difficult person to deal with, Li Xiao, letting out a sigh of relief in his heart. While Xin Yuanling was deep in thought, Xiao Chen walked into the room. His face was calm, and there was nothing different about him. But when he saw Xin Yuanling, Xiao Chen softly asked, "Do you know everything?" Xiao Chen was clearly asking about Li Xiao. Li Xiao's death was suspected to have been killed by people sent by the sword sect. This matter had already spread through the wide world, so it was hard not to know. Hearing this, Xin Yuanling gave a slight nod, indicating that he already knew. "What do you think?" Seeing Xin Yuanling nod, Xiao Chen continued to ask. "It's nothing. The innocent will know. It wasn't us who did it. No one can slander us." Hearing this, Xin Yuanling softly said, "Who do you think killed Li Xiao?" "Third brother. You've already guessed it. Why are you asking me?" Xiao Chen naturally guessed that Xie Tian was behind all of this. The reason why he asked this was because he had some things he wanted to say to Xin Yuanling. If even Xiao Chen could guess it, then Xin Yuanling must have guessed it as well. He looked at Xin Yuanling deeply. After a moment of silence, Xiao Chen asked, "You knew this would happen, but you didn't do anything. Brother, you wanted to get rid of Li Xiao, didn't you?" Xiao Chen guessed that the one who made a move was Xie Tian and guessed that Xin Yuanling already knew about this, but Xin Yuanling kept silent. He clearly had a chance to save Li Xiao, but Xin Yuanling did not do it. He wanted to borrow Xie Tian's hand to get rid of the obstacle that was Li Xiao. Faced with Xiao Chen's question, Xin Yuanling did not reply or refute it. There were some things that he knew in his heart, and it was best not to involve Xiao Chen in this matter. The two brothers looked at each other. Looking at Xin Yuanling's eyes, Xiao Chen already knew everything. Taking a deep breath, Xiao Chen stood up and looked at Xin Yuanling with a complicated gaze as he said, "It's been hard on you, big brother." Along the way, Xiao Chen was no longer the simple youth from before. A power, a sect that had a bright side and naturally had a dark side. Many times, if a sect wanted to develop, they had to use unscrupulous methods. But Xin Yuanling had taken all of this for himself. For the development of the sword sect, Xin Yuanling's methods could not be considered glorious, but to a large extent, he had cleared all obstacles for the sword sect. He did not have any intention of blaming Xin Yuanling. Xin Yuanling had done everything for himself. So how could Xiao Chen blame him? He had given all the good things to himself, and Xin Yuanling had taken all the blame for himself. Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Xin Yuanling revealed a faint smile, and his heart was filled with warmth. There was no need for words between the two brothers, but they could quickly understand each other's thoughts. Leaving the rest of the matters to Xin Yuanling, Xiao Chen left Xin Yuanling's residence. When Xiao Chen returned to his cave, he saw Nangongguan waiting for him in the distance. Seeing Xiao Chun, Nangongguan took the initiative to speak with an angry face. "Sect Master, I have something to discuss with you." Nangongguan's expression was very unsightly. She no longer called Xiao Chun junior brother, but directly called him Sect Master. With a single glance, Xiao Chun could see that Nangongguan was different and abnormal, as well as the anger in her eyes. Xiao Chun nodded calmly. Then the two of them entered the cave together. In the courtyard, Xiao Chun had Nangongguan sit down and personally made her a cup of tea. Nangongguan angrily said, Sect Master, don't you think Xianyuan Ling has gone too far?" "Sect Master, isn't Xianyuan Ling going overboard? My sword gate prides itself on being a righteous sect. However, the things we have done recently are even worse than the evil cultivators. First it was the Saber sect, and this time it's even worse. He actually killed Li Xiao. How will the world view our sword sect now?" Nangongguan had indeed come because of Li Xiao, and after listening to her, it seemed that she had already determined that Xianyuan Ling was behind this. Indeed, the biggest suspect right now was the sword sect, and within the sword sect, Xianyuan Ling was the biggest suspect. Hearing Nangongguan's angry accusation, Xiao Qin's expression didn't change much. He was still incomparably calm, like an ancient well without any ripples. After Nangongguan finished speaking, Xiao Chun indifferently said, "Senior Marshal Brother, do you really believe that Big Brother did this? If it wasn't him, who else could it be?" Nangongguan angrily retorted, "Li Xiao is an Emperor Realm Master, but being able to kill him silently is impossible even for another Emperor Realm Master, unless it was an Ancestor Realm Master who took action. Right now, Honored Master is in the Saber sect, which means that only I can take action, but I haven't left the Sword sect recently. So who does Senior Brother think is behind this?" Killing Li Xiao silently without alerting anyone was indeed something only an Ancestor Realm Master could do, and in the current Vast Thousand world, there were only a few Ancestor Realm Masters. Nangongguan hadn't killed Li Xiao because she was angry before, but now that she heard Xiao Qin's words, Nangongguan quickly reacted, her expression changing as she looked at Xiao Chun with a complicated expression. "Is Junior Brother talking about Xie Tian?" Xiao Chun and Junhua didn't take action, so the only one left was Xie Tian. Moreover, Xie Tian had a reason to do so. Framing the sword sect after killing Li Xiao Chun was obviously reasonable. Frowning slightly, thinking about it now, this was indeed the case. Realizing the truth of the matter, Nangongguan felt a little ashamed. After all, she had been certain that this matter was done by Xianyuan Ling, begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of this chapter. Chapter 2636. This was because Xianyuan Ling had been planning this the entire time, and Li Xiao had died at this critical moment, so Nangongguan couldn't be blamed for suspecting him. This was because Xianyuan Ling had been planning this the entire time, and Li Xiao had died at this critical moment, so Nangongguan couldn't be blamed for suspecting him. To put it bluntly, because of the recent matters, Nangongguan already had feelings for Xianyuan Ling, so it was very easy for her to form a preconceived notion. But hearing Xiao Qin's words, Nangongguan quickly found something strange. She also knew that there was a high chance that the one who did this was Xie Tian. Actually, this was a very normal matter. From the beginning, the matter of Li Xiao's death was easily explained by the sword sect. Xie Tian himself also understood this, so he never thought that just based on this simple matter, it would cause chaos in the sword sect. To put it bluntly, as long as the sword sect opened their mouth to explain, everything would be revealed. After all, this wasn't considered a high-level method of framing others. But there was one thing that couldn't be changed. It was that the sword sect did have thoughts about the other large powers. But even like this, once a gap was formed in their hearts, it couldn't be resolved just by explaining. The explanation was clear, but there would be a knot left in their hearts, and this knot was Xie Tian's goal. Even if everyone knew that Li Xiao was killed by him, so what? There was already a gap between the various powers and the sword sect, which gave Xie Tian a chance. In the future, Xie Tian would be able to expand this gap, causing the situation of the boundless world to fall into chaos. Nangong Guan didn't think of this, but it was impossible for Xianyuan Ling to not realize this. Actually, Xianyuan Ling had already realized this problem. Once this matter came out, even if it was explained, there would be a gap created. If he wanted to eliminate this gap, it wouldn't be that easy. But Xianyuan Ling didn't say anything about this and didn't even mention this matter to Xiao Chun. This was because in Xianyuan Ling's heart, there was an even bigger plan. There was one thing that Jun Wuya was right about. It was that having 4 people was the most reassuring. Xianyuan Ling's side didn't make a move. It was unknown what he was planning. On the other side, Xie Tian, who had returned to his residence, also didn't make any movements. After killing Li Xiao, Xie Tian didn't have any intentions of making a move. What a joke! Killing Li Xiao was to create conflict between the Sword Sect and the other large powers. If Xie Tian kept killing him, he would be playing into the Sword Sect's hands. Because of this, SS's heart. This was because if they all died's death, it would be over for the sword, as S's problem would be solved. This would save them quite a bit. So, Xie Tian was very smart. He only made a move against Li Xiao and left the others alive for now. Anyway, he would deal with them when he saw the door. Knots. Time. They didn't. But just like Xie Tian, Dan Xinyang and the others had complicated feelings. At the same time, there was a trace of fear and dissatisfaction in their hearts towards the Sword Sect. Although some people had already guessed that this matter wasn't related to the Sword Sect, the Sword Sect clearly had the ability to make a move against Xie Tian, but they didn't make a move. What did this mean? Did this mean that the Sword Sect wanted to borrow Xie Tian's hand to kill them? The 10 great Ling Tian sects of the past, after these years of war, they had suffered heavy casualties. Mu Tian Mountain, Weapon Sect, Heavenly Yin Tower, Heavenly Sect, and Dragon Palace. These powers had already turned to dust and no longer existed. As for the Heavenly Plan Palace, because of Li Zhao's death, it was only in name. The only Ling Tian sects left were the Blade Sect, Moon Palace, Dan Valley, Talisman Sect, and Shrines. As for these sects, the Blade Sect had already agreed to join the Sword Sect, and Blade Xiong was also willing to join the Sword Sect to become an old ancestor. As for the Moon Palace, there was no need to mention them. They had already sent people to express their intentions. There was no need to worry about the Blade Sect and Moon Palace, so there was only Dan Valley, Talisman Sect, and Shrines left. On this day, Dan Xinyang's group of 3 had indeed come to the Sword Sect, saying that they wanted an explanation. The actions of the Sword Sect had made them nervous, so they had personally come. Xianyuan Ling was not surprised by this. Moreover, the 3 of them didn't come looking for him. Rather, they came looking for Xiao Chun. In the main hall of the Sword Sect, Xiao Chun, Dan Xinyang, and the others were sitting together. Among them, the old ancestor of the shrines spoke with a dark expression. Sect Master Xiao, what is the meaning of the Sword Sect? Could it be that they won't even leave us a path of survival? What do you mean by this? Hearing this, Xiao Chun pretended to be confused as he asked this. Hearing this, the old ancestor of shrines spoke again. Humph! If Sect Master Xiao says this, then there's no meaning. We all understand Li Zhao's death, and we have never been disloyal to the Sword Sect. So why is the Sword Sect doing this? First, this one corrects something. Li Zhao's death is not related to the Sword Sect at all. Other than that, the Sword Sect has never thought of making a move against anyone. Humph! They haven't made a move, but they are very skilled at borrowing a knife to kill people. The words of the old ancestor of the shrines were without a doubt pointing out that the Sword Sect was using Xie Tian. Yes, your Sword Sect did not personally make a move against them, but you borrowed Xie Tian's hands to investigate them. Xie Tian could kill Li Xiao today, and your Sword Sect did not make a move. Then tomorrow, Xie Tian could kill everyone else here, and your Sword Sect would not make a move? Li Xiao clearly didn't need to die, and the Sword Sect's main focus should be on dealing with Xie Tian, but things did not develop like this. After all these days, the Sword Sect did not have any intentions of making a move against Xie Tian. When Xie Tian tried to kill Li Xiao, the Sword Sect did not make a move at all. Being questioned by the old ancestor of shrines, Xiao Chun revealed a smile, but there was a trace of contempt in his smile as he said, "This one does not understand what you mean. According to what you're saying, my sword sect has to take responsibility for everything in the boundless world? In the boundless world, who knows how many people die each day? Could it be that these deaths are all blamed on my sword sect? Could it be that my sword sect did not properly protect them?" The facts were indeed, as Xiao Qin said. First, the sword sect did not make a move against Li Xiao, and whether they were willing to deal with Xie Tian or not, that was the sword sect's matter. It was the same on the other hand. Xie Tian wanting to kill Li Xiao. How was that related to the sword sect? Li Xiao was not a member of the sword sect, so the sword sect did not have an obligation to protect him, right? To put it bluntly, this was not related to the sword sect at all. It was because they weren't strong enough and couldn't protect themselves. So who could they blame? Hearing Xiao Qin's words, the old ancestor of the shrines, as well as Dan Xinyang's group of 3, had ugly expressions. Please add, please vote, please recommend. Chapter 2637. Xiao Qin was right. The sword sect was the overlord of the great wide world, but they were not the nanny of the great wide world. They had no obligation and did not have the leisure to be responsible for everything in the great wide world. According to the meaning of the temple's old ancestors' words, it meant that with Xie Tian's appearance this time, all the people he killed should be counted as the sword sect's responsibility. This clearly couldn't be explained. Because they could not refute this, Dan Xinyang and the other two's faces became ugly. This was because Xiao Qin's words had no doubt expressed the attitude of the sword sect. In response, Xiao Chun sat on the main seat and calmly looked at the 3 people in front of him as he spoke in a calm voice. My sword sect's energy is limited, so it's impossible for us to not disclose anything. It's really hard for my sword sect to do the things you've mentioned. However, if it's our own people, then my sword sect will protect them with all its might. We will definitely not let something like this happen again. Hearing this, Dan Xinyang and the other 2 did not reply. However, with their intelligence, they clearly understood the meaning behind these words. To put it bluntly, it was to let them join the sword sect. As long as they were willing to join the sword sect, then they were their own people and the sword sect would naturally protect them. However, once they chose to refuse, then the sword sect would not care that much. After all, they were not part of the sword sect. It was very tactful, but the meaning was clearly expressed. This was what Xiao Chun and Xianyuan Ling had already discussed. However, hearing this now, Dan Xinyang and the other two's moods were clearly not good. Compared to before, the sword sect's attitude was clearly more resolute this time. They were determined to eliminate the influence of the Ling Tian sect in the great wide world, and there was no way for them to give in. Hearing this, the 3 fell into silence. After a while, Dan Xinyang was the first to speak. AI, it's true that a new emperor brings new ministers. Sect Master Xiao, this old man had already expected this, but when it came to making a decision, I still hesitated. Dan Xinyang sighed. These words came from the bottom of his heart. In response, Xiao Qin smiled. I know what everyone is thinking, but this is inevitable. Now is no longer the era where everyone only cares about their own family, so there must be a change. I can give you time to consider, but I hope that everyone can make a decision as soon as possible. Xiao Chun was not willing to waste too much time on the internal affairs of the great wide world, so he acquiesced to Xianyuan Ling's actions. Xianyuan Ling's methods might seem sinister and find it hard to accept, but it was the most effective method. But Xianyuan sect's people's family. But the sword sect had the ability. Sect, sword had the sect. They had the sect. Hearing Xiao Qin's words, Dan Xinyang didn't say anything and just nodded. The conversation in the hall did not last for long. In the end, Dan Xinyang and the old ancestor of the talisman sect stayed behind. They needed some time to consider, but they did not choose to leave the sword sect. As for the old ancestor of the shrines, he also said that he needed time to consider, but he did not stay in the sword sect. Instead, he returned to the shrines. Xiao Qin did not stop him. After asking Cangxing to arrange a residence for Dan Xinyang and the old ancestor of the talisman sect, Xiao Chun went all the way to Xianyuan Ling and briefly explained the matter. Xianyuan Ling sneered. It seems that the old ancestor of the shrines is unwilling to merge with the sword sect. Although Dan Xingyang and the old ancestor of the talisman sect did not agree to merge with the sword sect on the spot, they did not choose to leave. This was equivalent to expressing their stance. Perhaps they had already made a decision in their hearts, but they needed some time to accept it. In any case, they were in the sword sect, so what other choice did they have? The reason why they did not leave was to reassure the sword sect. As for the old ancestor of the shrines, although he also said that he needed time to consider, he directly left. In essence, he was completely different from Dan Xingyang and the old ancestor of the shrines. Perhaps the old ancestor of the shrines had some other thoughts that he did not speak of. Right now, the Saber sect, Lunar Palace, Dan Valley, and the Talisman sect are no longer a problem. Only the shrines and the Heavenly Policy Hall remain. Xiao Chun said indifferently when he heard Xianyuan Ling's words. There's no need to pay attention to the Heavenly Policy Hall. Without Li Xiao, they're already a pile of loose sand. We don't even need to do anything. It won't be long before the Heavenly Policy Hall falls apart on its own, Xianyuan Ling replied. There was indeed no need to worry about the Heavenly Policy Hall. Without Li Xiao, the Heavenly Policy Hall was like a group of dragons without a leader. Even if the Heavenly Policy Hall was able to survive, it would probably be less than 10%. There was no need to worry about it. On the other hand, the shrines were a little more troublesome. The shrine's patriarch probably had other plans in mind after leaving this time. Upon witnessing the chilling look on Xianyuan Ling's face, Xiao Chun asked, "So what do you plan to do now?" "Die if you don't surrender," Xianyuan Ling said flatly. Since the shrine's patriarch chose to leave, no one could be blamed for it. In this regard, Xiao Chun understood what Xianyuan Ling meant. Xianyuan Ling was probably going to attack the shrine's patriarch. However, there needed to be a reason for him to suddenly attack the shrines. If he attacked the shrines for no reason, Dan Xingyang and the rest might be disgusted. As though sensing Xiao Chun's concerns, Xianyuan Ling said confidently, "Don't worry, there will be a reason soon. Since the shrines don't choose my sword sect, their only choice is..." Before Xianyuan Ling finished speaking, Xiao Chun had already guessed it, so he continued, "Xietian?" "That's right. Since the shrines weren't willing to choose the sword sect, the only choice in the entire world was Xietian." According to Xianyuan Ling's guess, perhaps the shrines would secretly contact Xietian and form a cooperation. The content of this cooperation would be to rely on Xietian while keeping the shrines. In Xianyuan Ling's opinion, the shrines didn't have much of a choice, and this was very normal. After all, in the entire world, there was no other force that could compete with the sword sect other than Xietian. However, even if the shrines chose to cooperate with Xietian, it would be like asking a tiger for its skin. It seemed like they could keep the shrines, but in the end, it would be like sending lambs into the tiger's den. But Xianyuan Ling wouldn't give the shrines this chance. Once they found out that the shrines had any contact with Xietian, the sword sect would probably make a move against the shrines, colluding with evil cultivators. Perhaps even Dan Xingyang and the others wouldn't be able to say anything. When the time came, the sword sect would make a move to eliminate the shrines. It would be considered reasonable, and no one would say anything. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. This chapter ends. Chapter 2638. Xianyuan Ling guessed that the shrines would contact Xietian, so Xianyuan Ling had already sent people to closely monitor the shrine's movements. As long as the two sides made contact, Xianyuan Ling's side would be the first to know. Xianyuan Ling guessed that the shrines would contact Xietian, so Xianyuan Ling had already sent people to closely monitor the shrine's movements. As long as the two sides made contact, Xianyuan Ling's side would be the first to know. Seeing Xianyuan Ling's confident appearance, Xiao Chun did not say anything else. He was indeed very relaxed during this time, with Xianyuan Ling, Song Xing, and the others taking care of everything. Xiao Chun had become a shopkeeper who did nothing. Xiao Chun did not object, and Xianyuan Ling continued, "When we take care of the shrines this time, we can also take care of Xietian." Although Xietian had obtained the help of those old fellows from the Dark Era, compared to the last battle between good and evil, Xietian's threat to Shao Chun was not as great as before. Xietian had made progress, but Shao Chen's progress was even greater, and the sword sect had undergone a complete transformation. So, if the current Xietian wanted to fight against the sword sect, it would be a very difficult matter. Keeping Xietian alive until now was just to borrow his hands to deal with the Ling Tian sects, giving the sword sect an excuse to take care of them. Now that his goal had been achieved, Xietian was not that useful anymore. Without any value, Shao Chen naturally could not keep Xietian alive. The two of them looked at each other with a smile, and then Shao Chun quickly left, leaving everything for Xian Yuanling to take care of. The Saber sect side was almost done. The disciples who were not willing to join the sword sect were dismissed, and the people who were willing to join the sword sect would follow Dao Xiong and Junwia back to the sword sect. When the time came, Song Xing and the others would arrange for these disciples to join the sword sect. What was surprising was that of the Saber sect's disciples, less than a tenth of them did not join the sword sect in the end. The others all expressed their willingness to join the sword sect. This was not hard to understand. First, it was because Dao Xiong had joined the sword sect and became the old ancestor of the sword sect. Like this, the Saber sect's resistance was much less. Second, it was because of the sword sect's strength. Everyone in the Great Thousand World knew that the sword sect was the most powerful force. Countless people racked their brains to join the sword sect, but failed. Now that there was an opportunity, the Saber sect disciples would not give it up. The matter with the Saber sect was going smoothly. Needless to say, the Moon Palace was even more so. Luo Xing was 100% willing to join the Swords Gate. Furthermore, he had already made arrangements long ago. Those disciples who were not willing to join the Swords Gate were directly dismissed by Luo Xing. The Saber sect and the Moon Palace could be considered part of the Sword sect. As for Dan Xingyang and the old ancestor of the Talisman sect, although they did not give a clear answer, since they had chosen to stay in the Sword sect, it was only a matter of time. The series of changes in the Great Thousand World also shocked many martial artists. They knew that from now on, the Sword Gate would be the only one in power. With the disappearance of the Saber sect, Moon Palace, Dan Valley, and the Talisman sect, which power could threaten the Sword sect in the future. As for the Celestial Palace that was still wavering, it was nothing. With the Celestial Palace's prowess, it would be a piece of cake for the Swords Gate to wipe them out. The only reason why the Swords Gate had yet to make a move was because they were waiting for an opportunity. Xian Yuanling was closely monitoring the shrine's movements, sending back news every day. However, up until now, he had not found any contact between the shrines and Xietian. Xian Yuanling was not worried about this because he knew that the shrines did not have a choice. It was either the Sword Sect or Xietian. If the shrines chose the Sword Sect in the end, it would be even better. They would not need to make a move, and they would be able to solve the problems in the Great Thousand World. If the shrines chose Xietian, they would directly make a move and exterminate him. The shrines had been closely monitored by the Sword Sect for a long time. Dan Xingyang and the Talisman sect's old ancestor, who were in the Sword sect, had made a final decision after several days of consideration. On this day, the Talisman sect's old ancestor took the initiative to find Dan Xingyang. The two of them were in the Sword sect, and Shao Chun did not restrict their freedom, allowing them to walk around the Sword sect as they wished. Other than some important places, they were not stopped at all. When they arrived at Dan Xingyang's residence, Dan Xingyang was not surprised by the arrival of the Talisman sect's old ancestor. Instead, he said with a faint smile, "Since you've come to find me, I'm afraid you've already made your decision." His words revealed the Talisman sect's old ancestor's intention. The Talisman sect's old ancestor revealed a faint smile and said, "I've made my decision. What about you?" "About the same as you." Upon hearing this, Dan Xingyang smiled and invited the Talisman sect's old ancestor to take a seat. The two of them began to chat as they drank tea. "To be honest, I really can't bear to send Dan Valley to its grave. After all, this is my life's work." Dan Xingyang sighed as he took a sip of tea. No one would be willing to give up a force that they had built with their own hands. This was human nature. The talisman sect's old ancestor also expressed his understanding. However, the problem now was that they did not have a choice. Moreover, both of them were clearly aware that the Sword Sect had indeed done all they could this time. This was because the Sword Sect was fully capable of directly exterminating their Ling Tian sects. However, the Sword Sect did not do so. Instead, they gave them a choice and a way to survive. Although merging into the Sword Sect meant that the various Ling Tian sects had completely become history, many of their disciples had become disciples of the Sword Sect. This could also be considered as a disguised inheritance. At the very least, their lineage would not be cut off. Moreover, the Sword Sect treated these old fellows extremely well. It could be said that they had already shown sufficient sincerity. As long as they joined the Sword Sect, they would be able to become an old ancestor. Their status would be the same as Jun Wuya's. Of course, whether or not they were really on the same level, they still knew in their hearts. Although they were all old ancestors, they were completely incomparable to Jun Wuya. However, no matter what, they still had the title of Old Ancestor, and they did not lack various kinds of cultivation resources. On one hand, the Sword Sect had shown sufficient sincerity. On the other hand, the answer to whether they had a choice or not was already self-evident. Upon hearing Dan Xinyang's words, the Talisman Sect's old ancestor also had a helpless and bitter smile on his face. There's no other way. This is the general trend. No one can stop the general trend. That's right. Since that's the case, so be it. Moreover, I even contacted Dao Xiong yesterday. This old fellow's cultivation actually showed signs of loosening after he thought it through. This is really a blessing in disguise. Dan Xinyang's smile became even brighter when he recalled what Dao Xiong had said to him. He remembered that Dao Xiong's tone no longer had the slightest bit of stubbornness in the message. Instead, it was extremely peaceful. It could be seen that this old fellow had really thought it through. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2639. Dan Xinyang smiled bitterly when he thought of Dao Xiong. That old fellow hasn't changed at all. Should I say that he's open-minded? Or should I say that he's open-minded? This old man actually told me that the world is now under the control of the juniors. Why don't we just join the Swords Gate and become the grand ancestors of the Swords Gate? Why should we bother ourselves with all these trivial matters? As for what the Great Thousand World will be like in the future, it'll be up to the younger generation. Didn't they go through the same thing in the past? Since Dao Xiong joined the Sword Sect, Dao Ju naturally had to join too. Moreover, Dao Ju joining the Sword Sect was completely different from Dao Xiong. Dao Ju would become a person with real power. Xiao Chen attached great importance to Dao Ju, Xiao Xiao, and the others. Therefore, they would definitely be put in an important position if they joined the Sword Sect. This was also something that made Dao Xiong feel gratified. In other words, although they had joined the Sword Sect, the leader of the Great Thousand World in the future would probably still be Xiao Chun. Dao Ju and the others had just changed from being in their own camps to being in the same camp. A smile hung on his face. In response to this, the Talisman Gate's old ancestor also smiled and said, "That brat from my clan also said the same thing. Let's just join the Sword Gate." Moreover, the Sword Gate seems to have already contacted that brat from my clan. Chu Ming? Dan Xinyang looked at the ancestor of the Talisman Sect and asked. The ancestor of the Talisman Sect nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Chu Ming was the only son of the ancestor of the Talisman Sect and was also the current sect master of the Talisman Sect. He didn't have any objections to joining the Sword Sect. Moreover, Chu Ming had already contacted the Sword Sect, or rather, Xiao Chun. Chu Ming probably also knew that the reason Xiao Chun wanted everyone to join the Sword Sect was so that they could contend with other universes in the future. Moreover, after Chu Ming and the others joined the Sword Sect, it didn't mean that they would be neglected. On the contrary, they would be put in an important position by Xiao Chun. According to Xiao Chun, Song Xing and the others were too old and probably had no hope of breaking through to the ancestor realm in this lifetime. They could handle some trivial matters, but if they were to carry the banner of the Sword Sect, they probably wouldn't be able to do so. Therefore, the Sword Sect would have to rely on the younger generation, such figures as Dao Ju, Xiao Xiao, and Chu Ming, in the future. They were all talented individuals, the best of the best in the Great Thousand World. Their futures were limitless. They were the future of Swords Gate, the future of the Great Thousand World. Moreover, the thoughts of the younger generation were obviously different from those of the older generation, like Dan Xingyang. Experts of the older generation, like Dan Xingyang, cared more about the inheritance and the rules of their ancestors. However, the younger generation didn't care so much about these things. In other words, in the eyes of the younger generation, the Sword Sect was enough to represent the Great Thousand World. Therefore, joining the Sword Sect wasn't considered forgetting their ancestors. After all, they were all people of the Great Thousand World. Therefore, the younger generation didn't have much objection to this matter. However, there was an exception now, and that person was Li Chun. When Li Xiao was alive, Li Chun became the strongest person in the entire Heavenly Policy Hall and also the person who was under the most pressure. This was because Li Xiao's death was a huge blow to the Heavenly Policy Hall. For a time, the entire Heavenly Policy Hall was in turmoil and everyone was in a state of panic. There were even many elders and deacons who chose to leave. Some of them didn't even say goodbye, seeing that the Heavenly Policy Hall was in a state of disunity. Although Li Chun tried his best to stabilize the situation, it was a pity that his prestige was still inferior to Li Xiao's. At the very least, it wasn't enough to convince everyone in the Heavenly Policy Hall. Everyone was in a state of panic, which led to the Heavenly Policy Hall's destruction even faster. Li Chun didn't doubt that the Heavenly Policy Hall would only exist in name if the situation wasn't stabilized as soon as possible. Although there was still a group of loyal people following him, there were too few of them. They were basically a drop in the bucket and wouldn't have much of an effect. Li Chun sat in the hall with a gloomy face. He hadn't rested for half a month. He had been busy dealing with various matters in the Heavenly Policy Hall all day long. However, after half a month, the results were minimal. In the current Heavenly Policy Hall, there were dispirited disciples everywhere. They were confused about the future, and no longer believed in their sect. Moreover, this kind of mood was becoming more and more intense. His face was dark to the extreme. In Li Chun's eyes, although the person who caused this was Xie Tian, he hated the Sword Sect. He hated the Sword Sect for clearly having the ability to stop everything. But why didn't they make a move? They just watched as Li Xiao was killed by Xie Tian. Sword Sect, Xiao Chun, you put on a righteous appearance all day, but you are actually jackals of the same tribe as Xie Tian. Just because my Heavenly Policy Hall blocked your path, you want to borrow a knife to kill people? In the hall, Li Chun couldn't help angrily cursing. Hearing this, a Heavenly Policy Hall elder on the side quickly tried to persuade him. Sect Master, you can't speak nonsense. If this reaches the Sword Sect's ears, the Heavenly Policy Hall will be in danger. You can eat whatever you want, but you can't speak whatever you want. But Li Chun, who was clearly angry, how could he care about this right now? Faced with this elder's persuasion, Li Chun still kept cursing. Humph, why can't I say it? You have the guts to do it, but you don't have the guts to let people say it? What did my Heavenly Policy Hall do wrong? Could it be that because Master doesn't agree to joining the Sword Sect, the Sword Sect wants to eliminate my Heavenly Policy Hall? Moreover, they're using such a sinister method, borrowing a knife to kill people. What difference is there between the Sword Sect's actions and colluding with the evil path? Li Chun became more and more excessive as he spoke. The current him was already blinded by hatred, unable to see the essence of this matter at all. Indeed, the Sword Sect did have the idea of borrowing a knife to kill people, but the Sword Sect did not instigate Xie Tian. It was only because Xian Yuanling had guessed Xie Tian's thoughts. It could be said that Xie Tian killing Li Xiao was not related to the Sword Sect at all. The Sword Sect did not interfere, so if the Sword Sect didn't make a move to save him, what was wrong with that? Saving you was affection, but it was not an obligation. But Li Chun clearly did not care about this right now. He only thought that the one who caused this was the Sword Sect. It was because of the Sword Sect's indifference that Li Xiao had died, and the Heavenly Policy Hall had fallen to this point. He couldn't help angrily roaring into the sky. Sword Sect, Xiao Chun, I directly swear that I will obtain justice in this life. I won't accept this. I won't accept this. Li Chun's voice was very loud, and he didn't intend to hide it at all. After hearing Li Chun's angry roar, the elder's face turned gloomy. He could naturally tell that Li Chun's emotions were a little off at this very moment. Begging for collection, begging for votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2640. The hatred in Li Chun's eyes was almost gushing out. Looking at Li Chun's furious appearance, the elder shook his head with an ashen face. He knew that Li Chun had completely lost his mind because of Li Xiao's death. Everyone knew how serious it was for Li Chun to express his hatred for the Swords Gate so boldly at such a time. If these words were to reach the ears of the higher-ups in the Sword Sect, Li Chun's outcome could be predicted. Perhaps Xiao Chun wouldn't say anything, but what about the other higher-ups in the Sword Sect? Would they allow someone who hated the Sword Sect to exist in this world? What the Sword Sect needed now was stability. This was very clear from the recent actions of the Sword Sect. Li Chun's hatred was an unstable factor for the Sword Sect. Thinking about it, even Li Xiao and the Sword Sect could leave him in the lurch and could even be said to have deliberately set him up, let alone Li Chun. With the Heavenly Policy Mansion's current strength, it was tantamount to courting death if they wanted to contend with the Sword Gate. Therefore, if Li Chun was rational, he could not show the slightest bit of hatred, let alone not conceal it so openly. Li Chun's actions were undoubtedly courting death. He was challenging the Sword Sect's bottom line. It was hard to imagine how the Sword Sect would react if this matter were to reach the ears of the Sword Sect. However, no matter what their reaction was, it shouldn't be good news for Li Chun. There is no such thing as an airtight wall in the world, especially for the Sword Sect. With the Sword Sect's current control over the Great Thousand World, there were very few things that the Sword Sect did not know. It could even be said that as long as the Sword Sect wanted to, there was almost nothing that they didn't know. Therefore, Li Chun's roar in the Heavenly Policy Mansion's main hall and his hatred for the Sword Sect naturally spread to the Sword Sect and Xin Yuanling's ears. After listening to the elder's report, Xin Yuanling's expression did not change. He just waved his hand gently and said, "I understand. You may leave." "Do we need to warn them about Li Chun?" the elder asked hesitantly when he heard that. Li Chun had been insulting the Sword Sect all day long and crazily slandering the Sword Sect. Now that the Sword Sect knew about it, it was obvious that it had caused quite a commotion. If Li Chun continued like this, it wouldn't be a good thing for the Sword Sect. Therefore, the elder wanted to warn Li Chun to stop talking nonsense. However, Xin Yuanling said indifferently, "I will deal with this matter." Xin Yuanling did not think of warning Li Chun. Given Li Chun's current situation, what was the use of warning him? If Li Chun was really afraid of a warning, then he probably wouldn't have said such a thing. To put it bluntly, the current Li Chun was like a gambler who had lost his eyes and did not care about the consequences. There is only one way to make such a person shut up. Xin Yuanling did not tell Xiao Chun about this matter. That night, he found Long Qing, and the two of them went to the Sword Sect alone. Xin Yuanling looked at Long Qing and said, "Second sister, you know about Li Chun's matter, right? This brat has been insulting the Sword Sect and third brother all day long. He even said that he would take revenge one day." "Yes." Hearing Xin Yuanling's words, Long Qing softly nodded. Long Qing had naturally heard about Li Chun's matter. Seeing this, Xin Yuanling's expression remained calm as he said, "I want second sister to go there personally." "Go to the Heavenly Policy Mansion?" Long Qing asked. Xin Yuanling nodded in agreement. He wanted Long Qing to go to the Heavenly Policy Mansion personally. Soon, Long Qing guessed Xin Yuanling's intention. Her expression changed slightly as she said, "You want to kill Li Chun?" If it was just a simple warning, Long Qing would not have to come personally. Since Xin Yuanling had found Long Qing and met her secretly, there was only one possibility. Xian Yuan Ling wanted Li Chun dead, and the best person to do it was naturally Long Qing. First of all, Xian Yuan Ling did not have time to leave the sword sect for the time being. He had to stay behind to deal with other matters. Second, Song Xing, Nangong Guan, and the others would probably not accept Xian Yuan Ling's orders. And Long Qing was just right. First of all, Long Qing was strong enough, and she was close to Shao Chun and Xian Yuan Ling. They had a close relationship, so there was no need to worry about Long Qing betraying them. Moreover, it was best to do it secretly. After all, killing Li Chun was not a good thing. It would also affect Shao Chun's reputation, so it was best not to have anything to do with Shao Chun. Of course, the main reason was that Li Chun was courting death. If he had not spouted nonsense, Xian Yuan Ling probably would not have touched him. He could even have let him go. After all, Li Chun was not a threat to the Swords Gate. It was not impossible to let him live. However, Li Chun did not know what was good for him. He insisted on spreading rumors that were unfavorable to the Sword Sect. This was something Xian Yuan Ling could not accept. Obviously, the best way to shut Li Chun up was to kill him. When she heard that Xian Yuan Ling wanted her to go to the Heavenly Policy Mansion to kill Li Chun, Long Qing was stunned at first. However, she quickly recovered and nodded. Okay. Long Qing did not refuse because he knew that Xian Yuan Ling was doing this for Shao Chen's sake. It could be said that Xian Yuan Ling's actions during this period of time were all for Shao Chen's sake. For this reason, Xian Yuan Ling did not hesitate to bear the infamy. Recently, Xian Yuan Ling's reputation in the Sword Sect had plummeted. Many people thought that Xian Yuan Ling's methods were too vicious and despicable. There were many complaints about Xian Yuan Ling. If it was not for Shao Chen's forceful suppression, many people would have stood out to oppose him. But even so, Xian Yuan Ling did not have the slightest intention of backing down. This was because Xian Yuan Ling knew very well that the Sword Sect needed someone like him to clear all the obstacles in front of him. After completely clearing all the obstacles in the Sword Sect, Xian Yuan Ling would naturally withdraw. He would hand over all the rights in his hands and become an idle person who did not care about anything. But now, the matter was not finished. It was not time for Xian Yuan Ling to withdraw. Li Chun's matter was just an interlude to Xian Yuan Ling. After receiving Long Qing's reply, Xian Yuan Ling did not stay for long. He stood up and left. Second sister, it's best to do this in secret. Don't let others know. Also, don't tell third brother. If he asks about it in the future, I will tell him. After saying that, Xian Yuan Ling strode away. Long Qing also left the Sword Sect that night and rushed to the Heavenly Policy Mansion. Everything that was unfavorable to the Sword Sect was Xian Yuan Ling's target. It was the same for Li Chun. Chapter 2641. At night, the Heavenly Policy Mansion was in complete silence. Due to the recent turmoil, the entire mansion was filled with a gloomy atmosphere. Many of the mansion's disciples didn't seem to harbor any hope for the future. Under the cover of the night, a figure quietly entered the Heavenly Policy Mansion. No one discovered the existence of this figure. It was apparent that something big was going to happen in the Heavenly Policy Mansion tonight. At the same time, Dan Xingyang and the Talisman Gates Patriarch were in the Sword Sect. It was already late at night, but they weren't resting or cultivating. Instead, they were sitting on the stone benches in the courtyard. Li Chun, that kid. Sigh. What a pity. Dan Xingyang let out a sigh as though he felt sorry for Li Chun. Recently, Li Chun had been cursing and speaking ill of the Sword Sect and Shao Chun. Dan Xingyang and the Talisman Gates Patriarch were naturally aware of these matters. With their experience, perhaps they had already guessed what Li Chun's outcome would be. It was imaginable that Li Chun wouldn't have a good ending after cursing the Sword Sect and Shao Chun so brazenly. Upon hearing Dan Xingyang's words, the Talisman Gates Patriarch didn't respond. But judging from his expression, it was apparent that he had the same thoughts as Dan Xingyang. It was especially so now when Xian Yuan Ling was handling all the matters in the Sword Sect. Shao Chun basically wouldn't interfere, so Li Chun definitely didn't stand a chance. Compared to Shao Chun, Xian Yuan Ling was obviously more ruthless. If it were Shao Chun, perhaps Li Chun would still have a chance to keep his life out of consideration for their past relationship. But if it were Xin Yuanling, this chance was obviously non-existent. Xin Yuanling wasn't as sentimental as Xiao Chun. In everyone's eyes, Xin Yuanling was like an executioner. He wasn't even willing to let go of the Dan Valley and the Talisman Gate, not to mention Li Chun. Li Chun had been completely blinded by anger and actually did such a suicidal thing. He did not doubt that Xin Yuanling would kill Li Chun. Perhaps Xin Yuanling had already made his move. Dan Xingyang and Li Chun had foreseen Li Chun's outcome. On the other side, in Li Chun's residence in the Heavenly Policy Mansion, Li Chun was drinking alone in the courtyard. His back view looked a little bleak. At this moment, Long Qing's figure suddenly appeared behind him. Since they were already here, Long Qing no longer hid her thoughts. Li Chun also noticed Long Qing's aura immediately. He poured himself a glass of wine and said without turning his head, "Back then, Master was killed like this. What? Is Xiao Chun going to use the same trick again?" And this time, he actually took action personally. With that, Li Chun finished the wine in his cup in a single gulp. Only then did he turn around unhurriedly. He looked at Long Qing with mockery and hatred in his eyes as he spoke indifferently. Facing Long Qing's arrival, Li Chun did not seem to be surprised, nor did he have the slightest fear. It was as if he had already expected everything. Looking at Li Chun, who was much more haggard than before, Long Qing said expressionlessly, "The sword sect can't be blamed for Li Zhao's matter. You should know this clearly." It seems that I still underestimated the shamelessness of the sword sect. In order to control the great thousand world, you really can do anything. What? You dare to do it, but you don't dare to admit it? Li Chun replied. Li Chun had long blamed everything on the sword sect. He was certain that the sword sect was behind Li Zhao's death. Even when facing Long Qing, he did not have the slightest bit of regret. Hearing Li Chun's words, Long Qing frowned slightly. A faint chill rose in her eyes. Previously, she was still a little conflicted about killing Li Chun. But now, after seeing Li Chun for real, Long Qing knew that this person could not be allowed to live. It was no wonder that Xin Yuanling decided to kill Li Chun. This person clearly regarded the sword sect as a life and death enemy, the kind that would not rest until one of them was dead. Such a person could not be reformed. As long as he was not, he would always be at odds with the sword sect. Although Li Chun had a good relationship with the sword sect in the past, and even had Long Qing quite a bit of contact, that was in the past. Now, Li Chun had become the sword sect's enemy. Even if this enemy's threat to the sword sect could be said to be negligible, any danger must be nipped in the bud. This was what Xin Yuanling had always implemented. Since he couldn't reform Li Chun and couldn't change Li Chun's hatred for the sword sect, he could only kill him. Once he was dead, everything would end. Perhaps some people would say that the sword sect's approach was too cruel. No matter what, Li Chun had a good relationship with the sword sect. How could they kill him just like that? However, most of the time, many things were out of one's control. If it was possible, Xin Yuanling wouldn't want to kill Li Chun. However, there was no other way now. Li Chun couldn't turn back. He couldn't let go of his prejudice and hatred for the Sword's Gate. If a sect wanted to develop, it was impossible for it to have a bright side. It had to have a dark side. As the saying goes, a general success was built on thousands of bones. If a sect wanted to develop, it was also built on countless bones. Some people you didn't want to kill, some people you were willing to kill, but you had to kill them. This kind of situation was not uncommon in any sect. Taking a deep breath, Long Qing said indifferently, "No one expected things to develop like this. Li Chun, you chose your own path. Since this is the case, you have to bear all the consequences." "I know. No need to talk nonsense. If you want to kill me, just do it," Li Chun replied coldly. Seeing this, Long Qing no longer spoke nonsense. Taking a step forward, his figure instantly disappeared and reappeared in front of Li Chun, throwing out a fierce punch. Now, Long Qing's cultivation had reached the Emperor Realm Grand Perfection, much stronger than Li Chun. Facing Long Qing's punch, Li Chun did not choose to surrender. Although he knew that he was not Long Qing's opponent, Li Chun still chose to attack. Perhaps Li Chun knew the result from the beginning, but he still chose to do so. This was his stubborn side. He knew that it was a dead end, but so what? He still walked on this path without hesitation. The two's fists collided. Li Chun was directly sent flying without any resistance. Long Qing did not give Li Chun any chance to breathe. In response, Li Chun forcibly stabilized his body and immediately fought with Long Qing. The two fought fiercely, using killing moves. However, although Long Qing's attacks were ruthless, there was not much killing intent. This also showed that Long Qing did not have much killing intent towards Li Chun. But there was no other way. Li Chun was courting death. For the sake of the Sword Sect and Shao Chun, Long Qing could only kill. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation. Chapter 2642. No one came to stop the battle between Long Qing and Li Chun. Was it because no one in the Heavenly Policy Mansion knew about it? Or was there some other reason? But no matter what the reason was, no one from the Heavenly Policy Mansion showed up. Regarding this, Li Chun seemed to have an answer in his heart. Although he was seriously injured, he didn't have the slightest intention of giving in. However, he wore a bitter smile on his face. Haha, the Heavenly Policy Mansion that Master established single-handedly is actually a bunch of spineless cowards. They must have secretly submitted to the Sword Sect, right? It wasn't that no one noticed Long Qing's arrival, but after everyone noticed, no one stepped forward. It could even be said that Li Chun's remarks were probably secretly told to the Sword Sect by the higher-ups of the Heavenly Policy Mansion. They knew that going against the Sword Sect was a dead end, so they betrayed Li Chun. Or perhaps it couldn't be considered a betrayal. After all, there were people who tried to dissuade Li Chun, but Li Chun didn't listen at all. Everyone could tell that Li Chun was a little crazy. Since Li Chun was bent on seeking death, the higher-ups of the Heavenly Policy Mansion had no choice but to fight for a way out for themselves. It could be said that Li Chun had been abandoned by the Heavenly Policy Mansion. Li Chun guessed that he had been abandoned by his own sect. However, it could be said that it was the result of Li Chun's stubbornness that got to this point. Upon hearing this, Long Qing didn't say anything. Although his expression was a little ugly, Long Qing didn't stop. Li Chun's death was probably a foregone conclusion. Meanwhile, in the Sword Sect, Shao Chen's residence. At this moment, Shao Chun was sitting alone in the courtyard with a calm expression. Qin Shu and Flower Fairy were beside him. Upon seeing that Shao Chun seemed to be in low spirits, Flower Fairy asked softly, "Are you still thinking about Li Chun? Sai, what a pity. We were once friends, but in the end, we were unable to walk together." Shao Chun sighed softly when he heard that. Although Xin Yuanling didn't tell Shao Chun about this matter, it didn't mean that Shao Chun didn't know about it. Although it seemed that Shao Chun didn't care about the Sword Sect, Shao Chun knew everything about the Sword Sect. The fact that Xin Yuanling had sent Long Qing to the Heavenly Policy Mansion was naturally not hidden from Shao Chun. Shao Chun did not question Xin Yuanling about this because he knew what Xin Yuanling meant. He also knew that Xin Yuanling had done this for him. However, when he thought about Li Chun being killed, Shao Chun felt uncomfortable. Although he wasn't very close to Li Chun, they were still acquaintances. Now that the Sword Sect had killed him, how could Shao Chun not feel anything? He felt pity, but more than that, he felt helpless. After saying that, Shao Chun took a sip of wine and said with disappointment, Li Chun, why do you want to die so badly?" If Li Chun didn't want to die, Shao Chun definitely wouldn't touch a hair on his head. Even if he didn't want to join the Sword Sect, Shao Chun could guarantee his safety for the rest of his life. Xin Yuanling also had the same thought. Unfortunately, the most uncontrollable thing in this world was the human heart. You couldn't control the thoughts of others. Just like Li Chun, Shao Chun hoped that he could persuade him to let go of his prejudice and not seek his own death. But Shao Chun knew that it was impossible. Li Chun wouldn't give up. That was why he could only kill him. Shao Chun's eyes became a little red and watery as he spoke. He felt sorry and sad for Li Chun Chao. Please. At that moment, Shao Chun seemed to have sensed something. His heart skipped a beat and his face turned pale. But in response, Shao Chun shook his head and didn't say anything. Li Chun was dead in the end. He was killed by Long Qing. After Long Qing killed Li Chun with his final blow, the higher-ups of the Heavenly Policy Mansion appeared. They looked at Li Chun's corpse with complicated expressions. Some of them were sorrowful. Some couldn't bear to see Li Chun die. Some even revealed regretful expressions, as though they regretted their previous decisions. But no matter what they were thinking, nothing could be changed. One of the Heavenly Policy Mansion's elders cupped his fists and bowed to Long Qing. "Sir, there is no need for this. Give Li Chun a proper burial. Bury him together with his master." Before this person could speak, Long Qing had already waved his hand and spoke first. Li Chun was dead, and everything was settled. There was nothing wrong with burying him. This was also what Xian Yuanling had specially instructed. Upon hearing his words, the higher-ups of the Heavenly Policy Mansion cupped their fists and thanked him. Long Qing didn't stay for long. After killing Li Chun, he left immediately as though he didn't want to stay in this place for a second longer. No matter if it was Xiao Chun, Long Qing, or Xian Yuanling, who decided everything, they felt incomparably bitter after killing Li Chun. After succeeding, the three of them didn't feel the slightest bit of joy. Instead, there was only a hint of sorrow. Humans weren't plants and couldn't be emotionless. If it wasn't impossible, no one would be willing to do it, including Xian Yuanling. After receiving Long Qing's message, Xian Yuanling stood in the courtyard of his residence and looked up at the bright moon in the sky. After a long while, he let out a deep sigh. Then, he slowly poured the wine in the cup in front of him and said in a low voice, "Have a good trip." Li Chun was dead, and this news was spread across the wide world the next day. Of course, the ones who spread this news were the high-level members of the Heavenly Plan Palace. According to the high-level members of the Heavenly Plan Palace, Xie Tian had attacked the Heavenly Plan Palace again, and Li Chun had died at Xie Tian's hands. This matter was once again in Xie Tian's hands. But all of this wasn't important. Sometimes, who would care what the truth was? Just like Li Chun's matter. Many people guessed that it might be the sword sect's doing, but who dared to say it? Since the higher-ups of the Heavenly Policy Mansion said that Xie Tian was the murderer, then Xie Tian was the murderer. Even if Xie Tian refuted it, no one would believe it and no one would support it. Sometimes, when one's strength reached a certain level, the boundary between black and white was no longer that important. If one was strong enough, even black could be called white, and white could be called black. Moreover, after the news of Li Chun's death was announced, the elders of the Heavenly Policy Mansion announced that they would join the Sword Sect. As for the disciples of the Heavenly Policy Mansion, those who were willing to leave wouldn't be forced, and those who were willing to join the Sword Sect would become disciples of the Sword Sect. For a while, the Heavenly Policy Mansion's matter seemed to have been perfectly resolved, but there was a dark side hidden behind this that made people's hearts heavy. However, this was something that couldn't be helped. There was nothing that only had light, and there would be darkness if there was light. The two complemented each other and couldn't be separated. Chapter 2643. Li Xiao and Li Chun had died, and the Heavenly Policy Mansion had been successfully merged into the Sword Sect. Although this matter had attracted the attention of many people in the Great Thousand World, it came and went quickly. Li Xiao and Li Chun had died, and the Heavenly Policy Mansion had been successfully merged into the Sword Sect. Although this matter had attracted the attention of many people in the Great Thousand World, it came and went quickly. In just a few days, the matter of the Heavenly Policy Mansion seemed to have been forgotten by everyone, and no one took the initiative to mention it again. Just like that, the matter was quickly suppressed. Obviously, the shadow of the Sword Gate was involved in this matter. The Sword Gate didn't want the matter of the Heavenly Policy Palace to become a hot topic. Therefore, this matter was quickly suppressed. A few days later, Dan Xingyang and the old ancestor of the Talisman sect also took the initiative to look for Xiao Chun. When he heard that the two of them had taken the initiative to ask to meet him, Xiao Chun did not refuse. He even paid a visit to Dan Xingyang's residence. Recently, Dan Xingyang and the old ancestor of the Talisman sect had been living together. The Sword Sect did not stop them, nor did they monitor them. It was as if they trusted the two of them. When Xiao Chun arrived, Dan Xingyang and the old ancestor of the Talisman sect took the initiative to stand up and greet him. In response, Xiao Chun said with a smile, "Seniors, you're too polite." He was very polite to the two of them. To be honest, if it was possible, Xiao Chun was very willing to end the turmoil in the Great Thousand World in a peaceful manner and resolve this series of matters. However, this was impossible because the actions of the Sword Sect had undoubtedly touched the interests of many people, and it could even be said that they had destroyed their sections. Therefore, there would definitely be people who would not agree to it, and conflicts were inevitable. Among them, the Heavenly Policy Mansion was the most important. Li Chun and Li Zhao's death was a foregone conclusion, and Xiao Chun could not change it. Moreover, if he was given another chance, Xiao Chun would probably do the same thing again. Dan Xingyang and the Talisman Gate's ancestors sighed silently when they saw the faint smile on Xiao Chun's face. The two of them had taken the initiative to request to meet Xiao Chun. Clearly, they had already made a decision. Or perhaps they did not have any other choice. The three of them sat down in the courtyard, and Xiao Chun naturally sat on the main seat. Dan Xingyang was the first to speak as he looked at Xiao Chun, who was sitting upright. "Sect Master Xiao, this old man will speak bluntly. This old man has already decided to merge Dan Valley into the Sword Sect. I hope that Sect Master Xiao will agree." Dan Xingyang didn't waste his breath and directly expressed his stance. After that, the Talisman School's ancestor by the side also spoke in agreement and expressed that he was willing to merge the Talisman School into the Sword Sect. After hearing their words, although Xiao Chun had already guessed all of this, he still secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he said gently, "That's great. Dan Valley and the Talisman School had agreed to merge into the Sword Sect. In this way, the matters in the Great Thousand World were basically stabilized. There was only one shrine left, but it didn't matter as Xianyuan Ling had already made preparations." After chatting with Dan Xingyang and the Talisman School's ancestor for a long time, Xiao Chun was very happy about the two sects' submission. Xiao Chun had already made arrangements for the disciples of Dan Valley and the Talisman School. The disciples of Dan Valley and the Talisman School couldn't be treated like ordinary disciples. After all, their combat strength wasn't the most outstanding. Compared to ordinary disciples, the disciples of Dan Valley and the Talisman School were obviously more special. One was an alchemist, while the other was a talisman master. Therefore, Xiao Chun had already planned to set up a pill hall and a talisman hall for the disciples of these two sections. Moreover, Dan Xin and Chu Ming will be the hall masters of these two halls. Of course, all of this could only be implemented after the Sword Sect had completely accepted the disciples of these two sections. After talking for a while, Dan Xingyang and the Talisman School's ancestor also left the Sword Sect on the same day. They returned to their respective forces and prepared to start the matter of the two sects joining the Sword Sect. 600 after the matters of Dan Valley and the Talisman School were settled, Xiao Chun was in a good mood. At the same time, he began to prepare to deal with Xie Tian. Now that the situation in the Great Thousand World had been settled, Xie Tian naturally didn't have much use. Xiao Chun had this idea, and Xianyuan Ling also had the same idea. The two brothers clearly thought of the same thing. Therefore, after Xiao Chun sent Dan Xingyang and Chu Ming off, before Xiao Chun took the initiative to find Xiao Chun, Xianyuan Ling took the initiative to find Xiao Chun. The two of them came to the main hall of the Sword Sect. Xianyuan Ling had clearly received the news that Dan Xingyang and Chu Ming had submitted, so he didn't waste any words and directly spoke. "Third brother, we can make a move now." When the two of them were here, Xianyuan Ling and Xiao Chun would call each other brothers. Only when there were outsiders would Xianyuan Ling call Xiao Chun Sect Master. Hearing Xianyuan Ling's words, Xiao Chun nodded and said, "What about the shrines? Has there been any movement?" "Not for now, but I don't plan on waiting any longer." Hearing this, Xianyuan Ling shook his head and replied. He had always sent people to closely monitor the shrines. He thought that the shrines would take the initiative to contact Xie Tian, but up until now, the shrines hadn't made any movements. Could it be that they thought they could stall for time, by not making a move? If it really was like this, Xin Yuanling could only say that the shrines were thinking too simply. It was impossible for the shrines to stall for time. In a large world, the various Ling Tian sects had already submitted, and only the shrines hadn't replied. Like this, the sword sect clearly didn't have the patience to wait. Xin Yuanling was planning on waiting for the shrines to contact Xie Tian before using the excuse of colluding with the evil Dao to directly eliminate the shrines. But now, seeing that the shrines hadn't made a move at all, Xin Yuanling didn't want to wait any longer. He also didn't want to waste time with the shrines. Hearing Xin Yuanling's words, Xiao Chun didn't object and just asked, "Without evidence or reason, you want to directly make a move against the shrines?" If they wanted to make a move against the shrines, they definitely couldn't do it like they did with the Heavenly Policy Palace because it couldn't be hidden. So, to deal with the shrines, the sword sect would definitely make a move. Like this, everyone in the large world would know. Without reason or evidence, making a move against the shrines without any excuse would cause people to talk. Moreover, it was at this crucial time. Xiao Chun was a bit worried about this. Of course, Xiao Chun could guess what Xin Yuanling was thinking. As expected, hearing Xiao Chun's words, Xin Yuanling gave a cold laugh. If you want to condemn someone, you can always find a pretext. Just leave this matter to me. As expected, Xin Yuanling really did plan on doing this. Without evidence or an excuse, he would just casually find an excuse and make up some evidence. That would be enough. With Xin Yuanling's personality, he could definitely do something like this. Moreover, with the sword sect's current strength, to put it bluntly, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that a deer was a horse. If they said that you were guilty, then you were guilty. So, things like reasons and evidence were not important to the sword sect and Xin Yuanling. If they wanted to destroy you, they could easily find 100 reasons to do so. It was that simple. Chapter 2644. Just finding a random reason was enough to make the shrines fall into eternal damnation. This was the benefit of strength. In front of strength, perhaps even your excuses would seem weak. It wasn't that no one believed you, but rather no one cared about what you said. It sounded very cruel and hard for people to accept. After all, everyone loved the light and thought that the world should be bright, but where the light couldn't reach, there would always be darkness. This was something that no one could change. Just like the shrines, they could have chosen to submit like the Dan Valley and the Talisman sect, and nothing would have happened. But the shrines weren't willing. Perhaps it was because they didn't want to be swallowed by the sword sect, or perhaps it was because of some other reason. But no matter what the reason was, the shrines had made their choice, so they had to accept the consequences of their choice. Xin Yuanling didn't want to have anything to do with Xiao Chun, so he directly took the initiative to take care of it. Regarding this, Xiao Chun didn't say anything. The two brothers had a tacit understanding, so there was no need for words of thanks. After chatting for a while, Xiao Chun left, and Xin Yuanling directly targeted the shrines. Of the Ling Tian sects, only the shrines hadn't been taken care of yet. Since the shrines weren't willing to join the sword sect, there was no need for them to exist. Compared to the Heavenly Plan Palace, the shrines and the sword sect didn't have a good relationship. It had been like this since the beginning. So, if the sword sect wanted to deal with the shrines, there wouldn't be many people in the sword sect who would oppose it. It was like Xin Yuanling said, it was too easy to find an excuse. Since the shrines didn't take the initiative to contact Xie Tian, Xin Yuanling could only take the initiative to make a move. After a night of silence, the next morning, a piece of news that shocked everyone came from the sword sect. The shrines had secretly contacted Xie Tian with the intention of colluding with the evil martial artists. Now that the shrines were under Xie Tian's control, the sword sect was publicly attacking the shrines. When this news came out, the entire world was in an uproar. But very quickly, there were many people who understood the crux of the matter. It seemed like the sword sect was planning to make a move against the shrines. Only the shrines hadn't submitted. It seemed like the sword sect didn't have any patience. If they didn't submit, then they could die. The shrines' decision. At this time, the shrines wanted to remain silent to stall for time. It was a pity that their thoughts were too simple. Perhaps they thought that the sword sect was too gentle, stalling for time. But would the sword sect be willing? Everyone knew that the sword sect's words were made up, but so what? In a vast world, if the sword sect said you were guilty, then you were guilty. Even if the shrines tried to explain themselves, it was useless. As expected, after the sword sect released the news, in just a few hours, the shrines made a statement to the outside world. They insisted that they had been prayed and accused the sword sect of being overbearing, no different from the evil martial artists of the past. However, the Divine Hall's explanation didn't have much effect because everyone had already guessed the truth of the matter. Hence, the Divine Hall's explanation seemed so feeble and powerless. Even if the shrines were telling the truth, so what? Could everyone argue with the sword sect over this matter? It was definitely impossible, and no one dared to stand up. With the current attitude of the sword sect, anyone who stood up would be beaten to death. In the shrines, Shun Hui and the Lord of the Shrines sat opposite each other. Their expressions were somewhat serious, and the great ancestor of the shrines asked in a deep voice, "Has there been a response?" "Yes, but the effect is not obvious," Shun Hui replied. "Is it not obvious, or is there no effect at all?" "No effect." The great ancestor of the shrines had long guessed that the shrine's response would not have much effect because no one dared to respond to the shrines, let alone stand on the side of the shrines at this time. Therefore, even if the shrines tried their best to explain, and even if everyone guessed that this was a groundless accusation, so what? There was still no way to change the situation, and the shrines could not clear their names. The temple patriarch sighed and said helplessly, "Forget it, forget it. You're right. You're right. You're right." The great ancestor of the shrines had already guessed that this would be the result, but the shrines did not choose to submit to the sword sect because many shrines were opposed to this. Given the relationship between the shrines and the sword sect, the shrines were unwilling to submit to the sword sect or even be annexed by the sword sect. They would rather die than accept such an outcome. It could not be helped. The shrines and the sword sect had always been on bad terms. Unlike the Dan Valley, the Talisman sect, the Saber sect, and other forces during the era of the 10 Great Lingtian sects, the shrines and the sword sect had a rift. This rift caused many shrines to be unable to accept such an outcome. The divines were arrogant, and the shrines were even more so. Many people in the vast thousand domains knew this very well. Therefore, the shrines would rather be destroyed than be annexed by the sword sect. Seeing the great ancestor of the shrines sigh, Shan Hui's expression did not change as he asked, "Then what do we do now? Since we chose this path, we can only bear the consequences. Although we are no match for them, we have already made our decision. Even if we die, we have to fight." Hearing this, the great ancestor of the shrines calmly said, "Like Li Chun, the shrines were also seeking death. They knew that they were no match for the sword sect and knew the consequences of not submitting, but the shrines still chose this path of death. However, Li Chun sought death because of the hatred in his heart, while the shrines sought death because of the pride in their hearts. Their pride would not allow the shrines to be annexed by the sword sect." Hearing the words of the great ancestor of the shrines, Shun Hui nodded and did not say anything else. The shrines had already prepared themselves for battle. On the other side, Xietian and the others were in the sect. During this time, Xietian had been very quiet. The sword sect did not take the initiative to attack, and Xietian did not provoke the sword sect either. However, after hearing about the shrines, Xietian, who was sitting in the courtyard, revealed a faint smile and said, "These guys from the divines are still stubborn, ah." Xietian did not seem to be surprised by the shrine's choice. In response, an Emperor Realm cultivator behind him spoke up. His voice was cold, without the slightest trace of emotion. "Then, should we help?" Hearing this, Xietian coldly smiled and said, "Of course we should. After all, after the shrine's matter is over, the sword sect will probably make a move against me. Since that's the case, we might as well make them unhappy first. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. This chapter ends. Chapter 26:45. The sword sect's attack on the shrines was inevitable. Although the shrines had been trying their best to explain that the sword sect was slandering them and that it was complete nonsense, it was a pity that no one in the Great Thousand Worlds stood up to support the shrines. The sword sect attack on the shrines was inevitable. Although the shrines had been trying their best to explain that the sword sect was slandering them and that it was complete nonsense, it was a pity that no one in the Great Thousand Worlds stood up to support the shrines. Following the conflict between the sword sect and the shrines, Xin Yuanling also directly attacked the shrines. Just as Xin Yuanling had expected, the sword sect didn't have much resistance against the shrines. Even Nangongguan didn't say anything. Under Xiao Qin's orders, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, Nangongguan, and the other masters of the sword sect led a group of elite sword sect disciples and directly attacked the shrines. With the current strength of the sword sect, to put it bluntly, it was simply too easy to deal with the shrines. There was no pressure at all. The actions of the sword sect couldn't be concealed, and the shrines also received the news immediately. Before the masters of the sword sect arrived, the shrines had already activated the sect defending array and were prepared to fight to the death. On the surface, Xiao Chun and Jun Wuya didn't seem to have any intention of participating in this battle. As for the sword sect's Emperor Realm Masters, only about half of them were dispatched. It was obvious that they weren't using their full strength. But even so, it was more than enough to destroy shrines. Now, the number of Emperor Realm Masters in the sword sect had already reached close to 50. This time, nearly half of them were dispatched, so there were more than 20 of them. It was enough to crush the shrines. However, on the surface, the sword sect was like this, but secretly, Jun Wuya had already secretly returned to the sword sect. At this time, in Xiao Qin's residence, Jun Wuya and Xin Yuanling were already Longqing. The four of them sat together and looked at Xin Yuanling. Xiao Chun said with a soft smile, "It's about time for us to set off." Jun Wuya's secret return was to guard against Xie Tian. Although Xie Tian hadn't made any moves during this time, the sword sect had never relaxed their guard against him. Now that he had made a move against the shrines, in Xiao Chun and Xin Yuanling's eyes, Xie Tian would definitely interfere. So, on the surface, the sword sect attack on the shrines was just a cover. These people were indeed enough to destroy the sword sect, but they weren't enough to contend against Xie Tian's group. So, Xiao Chun and Jun Wuya were preparing to act in secret. In order to have a chance to kill Xie Tian, Jun Wuya had specially rushed back from the sword sect without telling anyone. Hearing Xiao Qin's words, Xin Yuanling nodded and replied, "In its time, the biggest enemy was still Xie Tian, so the sword sect's main focus was still on Xie Tian. This was understandable. The shrines to the sword sect were nothing more than clowns. There was no need to worry at all. In the dark, the sword sect sent out another group of experts. This time, the sword sect could be said to have gone all out. Their goal was to wait for Xie Tian to take the bait. Seeing the sword sect attack the shrines, Xie Tian would most likely not be able to hold back. This was Xin Yuanling's guess, so the sword sect had already made their preparations. One in the light and one in the dark. The sword sect's experts all entered the divine continent where the shrines were. The various powers of the divine continent naturally didn't dare stop the sword sect at all. Although many of these powers were subordinate sects of the shrines, now that the sword sect wanted to make a move against the shrines, these powers instantly changed sides. Shrines and sword sect. Who to side with? Even a fool would be clear on this and wouldn't hesitate at all. These powers couldn't be blamed. After all, compared to the shrines, the sword sect was like the sun in the sky. If anyone stood on the side of the shrines at this time, they would simply be courting death. The eyes of the entire world were focused on the divine continent, but the people of the world didn't doubt the results of this battle. The sword sect would definitely win. It was impossible for the shrines to stop the sword sect. Looking at the sword sect this time, they didn't even send half of their experts, but in terms of strength, the sword sect completely crushed the shrines. Even if the shrines had the geographical advantage, so what? Could the sect protecting array block the experts of the sword sect? Moreover, One shouldn't forget that the two ancestor realm experts, Shao Chun and Jun Wuya, had yet to make a move. The ancestor realm experts not making a move meant that the sword sect didn't place the shrines in their eyes. But if they really forced the sword sect, who could be certain that Shao Chun and Jun Wuya wouldn't make a move? An ancestor realm master was an existence that the shrines couldn't resist, so the outcome of this battle was already decided from the very beginning. On the surface, the numerous masters of the sword sect marched into the divine continent, led by Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the others. There were tens of thousands of them, and every one of them was an elite disciple of the sword sect. Although their cultivation wasn't a match, their combat strength was even more powerful. They didn't encounter any obstacles along the way, and in just a few days, Nangong Guan and the others arrived at the shrine's location. Looking at the sect protecting array in front of them, a cold light flashed across the faces of Nangong Guan and the others. Compared to Heavenly Policy Palace, Nangong Guan and the others obviously didn't have the slightest good impression of the shrines. It had been like this since the beginning, so this time, Nangong Guan and the others didn't object to Shao Chen's order to destroy the shrines. More than 20 Emperor Realm Masters stood proudly in the sky, looking down at the shrines below. Zhou Song sneered and said, "These guys are really going to resist to the end. We already expected this. If not, why would the shrines keep refusing?" Hearing this, Wu Huan replied. The two of them spoke casually, while Nangong Guan shouted coldly, "People of the shrines, listen up. Those who surrender will be spared. Immediately activate the sect protecting array." Nangong Guan said. However, the shrines didn't respond, nor did they show any intention of activating the sect protecting array. Nangong Guan didn't waste any more words and waved her hand, shouting in a deep voice, "Kill! Break this tortoise shell!" As Nangong Guan's voice fell, the disciples of the sword sect all attacked, attacking the shrine's sect protecting array. In an instant, numerous attacks bombarded the sect protecting array from the sky. Furthermore, this time, in order to break through the auxiliary sect formation of the Divine Hall as soon as possible, Shao Chun had specially asked the Talisman School to send a few elders of the End Realm. Under their command, the places where the people of the Sword Gate attacked were all the weak points of the sect protecting formation, or rather, the formation core. As a result, the time needed to break the sect protecting array was much faster. Under such fierce attacks, the shrine sect protecting array was constantly trembling, as if it would collapse at any moment. With the help of a talisman master, it was naturally much easier to break the sect protecting array. This was something that everyone knew. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2646. The battle immediately broke out. The sword sect did not waste words on the shrines. Since they did not choose to submit, they could only wait to be destroyed. In the sky, all kinds of powerful martial skills were released. The shrine sect protecting array was like a lonely boat in the sea, ready to capsize at any time. The battle immediately broke out. The sword sect did not waste words on shrines. Since they did not choose to submit, they could only wait to be destroyed. In the sky, all kinds of powerful martial skills were released. The shrine sect protecting array was like a lonely boat in the sea, ready to capsize at any time. In the shrines, many shrines' disciples were frantically pouring their spiritual energy into the array, hoping to stabilize it. This scene was very similar to when the shrines faced Yetion. Even with the protection of the sect protecting array, it was only temporary. The sect protecting array would eventually break. Once the sect protecting array broke, the outcome of the shrines could be imagined. There were many cultivators secretly watching this battle in the distance, but no one dared to approach. Everyone was afraid of being affected. The sword sect's attacks were wave after wave. Inside the shrines, Shun Hui, the old ancestor, and the higher-ups of the shrines gathered in the main hall. Feeling the strong pressure coming from the array, everyone's expression was incomparably solemn. The shrines were already prepared to fight to the death. But being prepared was one thing, But when faced with this kind of situation, everyone could not help but feel nervous. Seeing everyone's solemn expression, the old ancestor of the shrines on the main seat said in a deep voice, "Everyone, this is the last battle of our shrines. Even if we die, we will not disgrace the name of the shrines." He did not say any words of encouragement, nor did he say that he could win. This was because the old ancestor of shrines was very clear that it was impossible to win this battle. This was also the result that he had long expected. The shrines battle would not change too much. What Xiao Chun and the others cared about right now was the movements of Xie Tian's group. Xiao Qin's group that had secretly entered the Divine Continent had not revealed themselves yet. If Xie Tian's group did not appear, Xiao Qin's group would not reveal themselves either. Hidden not far away from the shrines, they could also feel the strong pressure coming from the shrines. This was the aftermath of the battle. Sitting together with Xin Yuanling, Long Qing, Jun Wuya, and the others, there were also many masters from the sword sect around them. There weren't many of them, only 20 or so, but all of them were Emperor Realm masters. It could be said that all the masters above the Emperor Realm and the sword sect had gathered in the Divine Land, waiting for Xie Tian to appear. However, even now, there were still no signs of Xie Tian appearing. Logically speaking, the shrine's sect protecting array had not been broken yet. If Xie Tian were to appear, now would definitely be the best time. Everyone waited patiently together, but as time passed, Xin Yuanling's face became uglier and uglier. There was a faint premonition in his heart. Moreover, Xin Yuanling felt that he had overlooked something. There was an unknown panic in his heart, but Xin Yuanling could not find a reason for this panic. However, the more it was like this, the more absent-minded Xin Yuanling became. Seeing that Xin Yuanling's expression was a little strange, Xiao Chun on the side also asked, "What's wrong? Why is your face so ugly?" Hearing Xiao Chen's words, Xin Yuanling shook his head, indicating that he was fine, but he still had a thoughtful expression. Properly speaking, Xie Tian should have appeared because if the temple's sect protecting array was broken, there wouldn't be much effect if he appeared at that time. But even now, Xie Tian still didn't show any signs of appearing. Could it be that he had made a mistake? Xin Yuanling couldn't help thinking this. For a while, Xin Yuanling secretly thought over his plans from the beginning to see if there were any flaws. From when he was preparing to make a move against the shrines until now, Xin Yuanling had carefully thought over his plans. Making a move against the shrines, naturally there was nothing to say. There was no problem, and it could even be said that there was no need for a plan because destroying a single shrines was just too simple for the sword sect. Since there were no problems with the shrines, what about Xie Tian? Xin Yuanling carefully thought over it. According to Xin Yuanling's guesses, if the sword sect made a move against the shrines, Xie Tian would definitely not watch from the side. He would definitely make a move and would not let the sword sect easily destroy the shrines. Even if it couldn't cause much damage to the sword sect, it would at least make the sword sect unhappy. As long as it was like this, it would be enough for Xie Tian. So, Xin Yuanling was certain from the beginning that Xie Tian would make a move because no matter what aspect it was, he was not willing to see the shrines being destroyed by the sword sect like this. Or it could be said that Xie Tian had found a bit of value on the shrines. With Xie Tian's personality, he would definitely squeeze all of this value out of them. Only, Xie Tian still hadn't appeared, so this matter had become strange. Could it be that I was wrong? Muttering in a soft voice, Xin Yuanling even began to doubt his own guesses. Could it be that from the beginning, Xie Tian never thought of making a move and was willing to watch the shrines being destroyed by the sword sect like this? He wasn't even willing to take the last bit of value. If it was like this, then he really was thinking too much. Then Xie Tian probably wanted to fight the sword sect head-on. Completely ignoring the matter of the sword sect and the shrines, Xie Tian was confident that he could defeat the sword sect in a direct battle, even if it was Xiao Chun. But was it possible? Not to mention whether Xie Tian was confident or not. Just based on his personality, Xie Tian wasn't this kind of person. Even if Xie Tian was confident in winning, It was impossible for him to give up this kind of chance with his personality. This kind of chance to deal with the sword sect, Xie Tian wouldn't give it up. The more he thought about it, the more Xin Yuanling felt that he had made a mistake. But where did this mistake come from? It was impossible for Xie Tian to remain indifferent. It was impossible based on his personality. So where did the problem come from? Seeing Xin Yuanling fall into deep thought, Xiao Chun and Long Qing on the side didn't disturb him. Actually, the two of them also felt that it was strange. At this time, Xie Tian still hadn't appeared. Just as everyone was waiting patiently, Xin Yuanling's expression suddenly changed. He grabbed Xiao Qin's arm and said anxiously, "Let's go." "Wrong, I was wrong. Quickly go back. Go back to the sword sect." Sword sect. Hearing Xin Yuanling's words, Xiao Chun was stunned, not understanding Xin Yuanling's meaning for a while. But at this time, Xin Yuanling suddenly stood up and spoke in an anxious voice. Xie Tian's goal isn't the sword sect. This place isn't his goal. Begging for collection, begging for votes, begging for recommendations. This chapter ends. Chapter 26:47. Xin Yuanling's sudden words made Xiao Chun and the others confused, not being able to react to Xin Yuanling's meaning for a while. Xin Yuanling did not have any intention of explaining. He just wanted Xiao Chun and the others to return to the sword sect as soon as possible. Since just now, Xin Yuanling had been thinking about his plan the entire time, including guessing that Xie Tian would not remain indifferent. Since the beginning, Xin Yuanling had thought that Xie Tian would not interfere in the matter of the shrines. After all, with the help of the shrines, Xie Tian could fish in troubled waters. Even if he couldn't heavily injure the sword sect, he could at least make the sword sect feel comfortable. So from the beginning, Xin Yuanling had thought that Xie Tian would appear when the sword sect made a move against the shrines, interfering with the battle. It was because of this that Xiao Qin's group secretly rushed to the Divine Continent, secretly waiting for Xie Tian to appear. But now, after carefully thinking about it, Xin Yuanling finally found the problem. He had thought wrong from the beginning, and his direction was completely wrong. Xie Tian would indeed make a fuss about the matter of the shrines. This was not false. However, from the beginning, Xie Tian's target was not the shrines or the Divine Continent, but rather the sword sect. That's right, Xie Tian's target from the beginning was the sword sect. This was also why everyone waited until now and didn't see a trace of Xie Tian. It was because Xie Tian wasn't in the Divine Continent right now and had brought people to the sword sect. They had been completely fooled by Xie Tian. Xie Tian knew that the sword sect wanted to make a move against the shrines, so he created a diversion. When everyone thought that Xie Tian would interfere in the battle between the sword sect and the shrines, Xie Tian had placed his target on the sword sect. This was because Xie Tian was very clear that once the sword sect attacked the shrines, they would send out quite a few experts. Like this, the sword sect would be at its weakest at this time, because over half of the experts in the sect were attacking the shrines, and at this time, Xie Tian attacked the sword sect. In a situation where they had lost their experts, even if they couldn't take down the sword sect, they could at least make the sword sect pay quite a large loss. So, Xie Tian created a diversion. When everyone's eyes were on the Divine Continent and the shrines, Xie Tian brought people to the sword sect. Thinking of this, Xin Yuanling broke out in a cold sweat because he knew the result of this, and it was even more pleasantly surprised than Xie Tian expected. At this moment, not to mention over half of the experts in the sword sect, almost all the experts had gathered in the Divine Continent. They wanted to surround and kill Xie Tian, but who would have thought that this would give Xie Tian such a good chance? Xiao Chun, Jun Huiya, and all the other Emperor Realm Masters were currently gathered in the Divine Continent. The sword sect was just an empty shell, and in this situation, there was no way they could stop Xie Tian. Once Xie Tian noticed this, he wouldn't hesitate to destroy the sword sect and take drastic measures. Moreover, the most important thing was that Qin Shu, Lu Bingning, and the other girls, as well as Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao, were still in the sword sect. If something happened to them, it would be a big blow to Xiao Chun. This went without saying. That was why Xin Yuanling was so anxious to ask Xiao Chun and the others to return to the sword sect immediately. Under Xin Yuanling's urging, Xiao Chun quickly came back to his senses. At the same time, he realized something and his face sank. Without hesitation, he left the sentence and disappeared on the spot. Ancient Chinese, I'll go back first. You guys go back as soon as possible. As an Ancestor Realm Master, Xiao Chun was naturally much faster than Emperor Realm Masters like Xin Yuanling and Long Qing. At this time, Xiao Chun naturally didn't care about the others. He just wanted to rush back to the sword sect as soon as possible, praying in his heart that no accidents would happen. Xiao Chun left quickly. Seeing this, Jun Wuya also wanted to take a step. As an Ancestor Realm Master, Jun Wuya's speed was naturally not good, while Xin Yuanling and the others followed closely behind. They had miscalculated, and it was a major miscalculation. From the beginning, Xin Yuanling never thought that Xie Tian would target the sword sect. Or rather, Xin Yuanling never thought that Xie Tian would be so bold as to attack the sword sect directly. Now, he didn't know where Xie Tian was, or if there was still time. Xin Yuanling only hoped that Qin Shiru and the others, as well as Xiao Yao and Xiao Lao, were fine. Otherwise, even if the sword sect survived, Xiao Chun would not be able to accept such an outcome. It was possible that his mind would collapse. Xin Yuanling was very clear on the feeling Xiao Chun had for Qin Shiru and the other girls. The matter of the past was still fresh in his mind. If it happened again, Xin Yuanling was afraid that Xiao Chun wouldn't be able to hold on. I hope they're fine. They have to be fine. There's still time. There's definitely time. While quickly moving, Xiao Chun kept saying this in his heart. Already understanding the meaning of Xin Yuanling's words, Xiao Chun was now filled with anxiety. He didn't even have a mind to wait for Jun Wuya as he rushed towards the sword sect. At the same time, he increased his speed to its peak, not caring about the consumption of his spiritual energy at all. When Xin Yuanling sensed the danger of the situation, on the other side, Xie Tian really did what Xin Yuanling thought and brought people to the sword sect. Moreover, because they were a step ahead and adding in the fact that the sword sect wasn't on guard, Xie Tian's group was already very close to the sword sect. They were even at the foot of East Sword City. East, South, West, and North Sword Cities. These are the 4 gates of the sword sect. Let this one collect some interest today and destroy East Sword City. Xie Tian was planning to directly destroy East Sword City, but this was good news for Xiao Chun. Xie Tian didn't know that Xiao Chun's group wasn't in the sword sect, so he didn't think that he could destroy the sword sect in one fell swoop. This trip was just to collect some interest. So, Xie Tian didn't head straight for the sword sect because he would be surrounded if he wasn't careful. First, destroying East Sword City. To put it bluntly, 1, it would make the sword sect suffer quite a bit of losses, and 2, it would give him a path of retreat. If East Sword City was destroyed in a short period of time, it would be hard for the sword sect to form an effective encirclement. This was Xie Tian's idea. Even if he couldn't beat them, Xie Tian could still retreat along East Sword City. Of course, this was because Xie Tian didn't know the current situation in the sword sect. After all, the matter of Xiao Chen's group heading to the Divine Continent was a secret. Even in the sword sect, there weren't many people who knew about it. Otherwise, once Xie Tian knew that Xiao Chen's group wasn't in the sword sect, Xie Tian wouldn't have cared about East Sword City and would have headed straight for the sword sect. Destroying the sword sect was much better than destroying the Eastern River sect. Moreover, one shouldn't forget that Xiao Chen's family was still in the sword sect. Chapter 2648. If he could capture Xiao Chen's family, which was Qin Shiru and the other girls, there was no need to mention how important it would be to restrain Xiao Chun. But it was a pity that Xie Tian didn't understand the current situation in the sword sect. If Xie Tian knew that Xiao Chun and Jun Wuya weren't in the sword sect, Xie Tian would have already headed to the sword sect and wouldn't have wasted any time in East Sword City. It was true that in order to build East Sword City, the sword sect had spent a large amount of manpower and resources. Destroying Sword City was not a small loss to the Sword Sect, but compared to capturing Shao Chen's family, a trivial Sword City was simply too small. Which one was more important? Even a fool could tell. It wasn't exaggerated to say that Shao Chen's family was worth at least 100 Sword Cities. This was because as long as he could control Shao Chen's family, Xie Tian would be able to control Shao Chun in a certain aspect. With how important Shao Chun was to his family, he would agree to any request. It was a pity that Xie Tian didn't understand the current situation in the Sword Sect, so naturally he couldn't make the most correct decision. After all, in a situation where he didn't know anything, how could Xie Tian head to the Sword Sect? If he headed to the Sword Sect right away, he would be surrounded when the time came. The North, South, East, and West Sword Cities stood on all four sides of the Sword Sect with the Sword Sect in the center. In this situation, heading to the Sword Sect was no different from walking right into a trap. So, Xie Tian taking the initiative to destroy Sword City and slowly plotting wasn't wrong. Of course, this was based on the premise that he didn't know the Sword Sect situation. But it was also because of Xie Tian's decision that it gave Shao Chun time, or it could be said that it gave Shao Chun a chance. Otherwise, even if Shao Chun was an Ancestor Realm expert, it would be impossible for him to rush from the Divine Boat to the Sword Sect in such a short period of time. However, right now, Xie Tian had wasted quite a bit of time in Sword City. This gave Shao Chun a chance to rush back. He didn't know what kind of good opportunity he had missed. As Xie Tian's voice fell, the experts beside him also made their move, sending various attacks at Sword City. There were indeed many warriors from the Sword Sect in the Sword City. Unfortunately, the highest cultivation among these people was only in the Enlightenment realm. Most of the experts were in the Divine Prefecture and were not here. So, facing the attacks of Xie Tian and the others, Sword City could not fight back at all and was quickly destroyed. With over 1,000 End Realm and Emperor Realm experts attacking at the same time, wanting to destroy a city was simply too easy. Adding in the fact that there were no experts guarding the city, it was as easy as flipping one's hand. Seeing how weak Sword City's defenses were, Xie Tian slightly knit his brows as he thought to himself with a bit of doubt. Logically speaking, Sword City should be very important to the Sword Sect, but this kind of central city didn't even have a single End Realm expert guarding it. There were only a few Enlightenment Realm experts guarding it. This was something that didn't make sense. There was a trace of doubt in his heart, but Xie Tian couldn't find an answer right now. Seeing Sword City being destroyed bit by his subordinates, Xie Tian didn't plan on making a move. Because based on the current situation, even if he made a move, there was no meaning. Sword City couldn't stop his group at all. Helplessly watching Eastern Sword City being destroyed and razed to the ground, Xie Tian said with a dark expression, "Continue forward." From Sword City, Xie Tian already felt that something was wrong. He was very curious why Sword City's defenses were so weak, but without an answer, Xie Tian could only continue forward. Now that Sword City had been destroyed and the cultivators in Sword City had all been slaughtered, Xie Tian had left a path of retreat for himself. Even if he attacked the Sword Sect and wanted to retreat, he could easily leave without worrying about being surrounded because he had already opened a gap. He felt like he had missed something. At the same time, the Sword Sect naturally received news of Xie Tian's group suddenly appearing in Sword City. Only, after the Sword Sect received the news, they didn't immediately send reinforcements to Sword City and chose not to make a move. It wasn't that the Sword Sect didn't want to save Sword City, but rather they didn't have the ability. The Sword Sect's experts had all gone to the Divine Continent, one in the light and one in the dark. It could be said that there were no experts in the Sword Sect at all. After Qin Shiru and the other girls received this news, they immediately rushed to the Sword Sect's main hall and temporarily took over the command of the Sword Sect. There was only an empty Sword Sect left, with only a few elders and deacons left. There was no hope that these people could stop Xie Tian at all. Seeing Xie Tian destroy Sword City and Shao Chen's group still not return, Qin Shiru and the other girls had incomparably serious expressions. Right now, Xietian didn't know the true situation of the Sword Sect, but once Xietian arrived at the Sword Sect and launched a probing attack on the Sword Sect, it wouldn't be hidden anymore. With Xietian's intelligence, it was very easy for him to guess the truth of the Sword Gate. When the time came, once Xietian confirmed that there were no experts guarding the Sword Gate, the consequences would not be something that everyone could bear. Big Sister Shui Ro, Big Sister 100 Flower, what do we do now? Sword City has already been destroyed, and Xietian is bringing people over. Beautiful Red looked at Qin Shu and 100 Flower Fairy with a worried expression as she asked this. The two of them could be considered the most prestigious existences among the girls. It wasn't just because they knew Xiao Chan the earliest, it was also because they were the most intelligent and mature among the girls. Xiao Chen's group wasn't in the Sword Sect right now, so Beautiful Red, Tian Yu, and Gu Ling Yao were naturally led by the two of them. Hearing Beautiful Red's words, Qin Shuru looked over at 100 Flower Fairy. In terms of intelligence, Qin Shuru admitted that he couldn't compare to 100 Flower Fairy. So at this time, Qin Shuru consciously gave the decision to 100 Flower Fairy. Of course, the elders and deacons on the side were the same. Right now, the entire Sword Sect was listening to the orders of the girls. As Xiao Chen's wives, the girls did indeed have the qualifications to temporarily take over Xiao Chen's command of the Sword Sect. In front of everyone's eyes, 100 Flower Fairy calmly said, "Husband's reply says that he'll be back in at most 2 hours. I estimate that Xietian doesn't know the situation of the Sword Sect yet, so we only have one thing to do now, and that is to stall. As long as we stall for time until husband comes back, it'll be considered a success. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." This chapter ends. Chapter 2649. When they learned that Xietian's group had suddenly appeared in Sword City, the girls naturally contacted Xiao Chun. Hearing 100 Flower Fairy's words, Qin Shuru and the others nodded in agreement. Xiao Chun had indeed replied, saying that he would be back in 2 hours. He had to make sure 100 Flower Fairy and the others could hold on. Actually, Xiao Chen's current mood was even more anxious than the girls present. He wished that he could return to the Sword Sect as soon as possible. Seeing everyone nod, 100 Flower Fairy also gave her thoughts. Right now, they could only stall for time until Xiao Chun came back. Only then would they have a chance of resolving this crisis. Otherwise, with the current situation of the Sword Sect, it was impossible for them to stop Xietian. Only 2 hours of time was not considered long, but it was also not considered short. Not to mention that after Xietian destroyed Sword City, it could be said that he was directly attacking the root of the problem. In front of him, there was no longer any obstruction, so Xietian could directly charge at the Sword Sect. So 100 Flower Fairy had to do something, otherwise it would be impossible to stall for 2 hours. Once Xietian arrived at the Sword Sect, and Xiao Chun didn't appear, Xietian would realize that there was a problem. Thinking of this, 100 Flower Fairy looked at the elders present and said, "Everyone, I'll have to trouble you to bring people to stop Xietian." The first step was, of course, to not let Xietian charge at the Sword Sect so smoothly. So along the way, they had to stop Xietian. Only, this time, because of the difference in strength, they couldn't fight Xietian head-on. So, 100 Flower Fairy's order was to stall Xietian, delaying him for as long as possible. Moreover, they could use various methods like arrays, pills, sneak attacks, and etc. They could fight while retreating. In any case, they had to delay Xietian's arrival at the Sword Sect. Like this, it wasn't impossible to complete this quest. After all, they didn't have to stop Xietian outside the Sword Sect. They just had to delay Xietian's arrival. Knowing that this was a critical moment, the elders did not object to 100 Flower Fairy's request. They nodded and went to prepare. Several elders quickly led a group of elite disciples from the Sword Sect out of the Sword Sect, heading in the direction Xietian's group had come from. Of course, they didn't make a big fuss, but rather they made sure to hide themselves. Xietian's side didn't know the current situation of the Sword Sect, So after leaving Sword City, Xietian didn't blindly head to the Sword Sect. Rather, he was very careful along the way. There was no other way. This was the headquarters of the Sword Sect, and Xietian didn't know that Shao Chun wasn't in the Sword Sect, so it was impossible for him to not be careful. If he mindlessly charged into the Sword Sect, what would he do if he fell into Shao Chen's ambush? Although he was curious why Sword City's defenses were so lax, Xietian still maintained a certain level of vigilance. Perhaps Xietian suspected that Sword City was bait that Shao Chun had thrown out. He deliberately let Xietian easily take Sword City to lower Xietian's guard. He then set up an ambush around the Sword Sect to take down Xietian's group in one fell swoop. It was because of this guess that Xietian was very careful with each step he took. This couldn't be blamed on Xietian. After all, this wasn't his first time fighting Shao Chun. Xietian was very clear in his heart that Shao Chun was not a person who was brave but not astute. Not to mention that under Shao Chen's command, the Sword Sect was filled with talented people. Such an intelligent person, and the two of them being old opponents, naturally, he was very clear on the other side's personality. So, Xietian had to be a bit more careful. But because of his caution, he gave the Sword Sect a chance to breathe. Adding in the fact that not long after they left Sword City, Xietian's group had been ambushed by the Sword Sect's disciples. The actions of these disciples were very strange. They would suddenly appear each time and never fight. After attacking once, they would choose to retreat and even use an array. This kind of action made Xietian's heart filled with doubt. Because this kind of action, it didn't seem like they wanted to surround and kill him. It was more like they were stalling for time. Stalling for time? Why did the Sword Sect make this kind of move? Was it because the encirclement hadn't been formed yet? Or was it because of some other reason that Shao Chun didn't want him to reach the Sword Sect this quickly? They were wildly harassed along the way, and this caused Xietian's group to become slower and slower. Although they had fought several times and Xietian's group had killed quite a few Sword Sect disciples, they didn't chase after them. One reason was because there was no meaning in chasing after these Sword Sect disciples, and two was because Xietian was afraid of falling into Shao Chen's trap. But the more it was like this, the more doubt Xietian had in his heart. This was because from the beginning, the Sword Sect's actions were very strange. First, Sword City's defenses were very lax, and then they sent people to stop them and stall for time. Everything seemed very strange. It didn't seem like the usual style of Shao Chun and the Sword Sect. If it was a normal time, Shao Chun and the other experts of the Sword Sect would have already made a move. But this time, up until now, Xietian hadn't seen Shao Chun, Jun Wuya, or any other Sword Sect experts. Up until now, the strongest experts Xietian had seen in the Sword Sect were only a few End Realm Elders. This was very strange. Properly speaking, he had already come knocking on their door, but where were the experts of the Sword Sect? Not a single one of them had appeared. This was very strange and very strange. He felt like he had overlooked something. Xietian thought to himself as he rushed over. At first, Xietian thought that Shao Chun was deliberately luring him into a trap to kill him. But now, this idea was becoming more and more unreliable because it was going too far. If Shao Chun really wanted to lure him into a trap, there was no need for him to send people to stop him. It was completely unnecessary. But if it wasn't to lure him into a trap, what was it for? Could it be that the Sword Sect really just wanted to stall for time? Thinking of this, Xietian suddenly thought of the battle happening in the Divine Land. The Sword Sect was attacking the shrines, so both sides should be fighting right now. But to deal with the single shrines, the Sword Sect clearly didn't use their full strength. Less than half of their Emperor Realm Masters participated in this battle. Moreover, Shao Chun and Jun Wuya didn't participate at all. Shao Chun and Jun Wuya didn't participate in the battle with the shrines, but were the two of them really in the Sword Sect? Suddenly, Xietian realized this, and his eyes revealed a look of wild joy. At this time, Xietian finally realized where the problem was and why the Sword Sect was acting so strangely. Please add, please vote, please recommend. This chapter ends. Chapter 2650. Since encountering the various obstructions from the Sword Sect and the weak defenses of Sword City, Xietian was very confused. This was because this series of actions were very strange. It didn't seem like Xiao Qin's personality at all. Since encountering the various obstructions from the Sword Sect and the weak defenses of Sword City, Xietian was very confused because this series of actions were very strange. It didn't seem like Xiao Qin's personality at all. Xietian had thought of many possibilities along the way, but he couldn't explain everything in front of him. Only now did Xietian finally think it through. The reason why the Sword Sect was wildly obstructing them and stalling for time was because they were using guerrilla tactics, running away after attacking, never coming into direct contact with Xietian's group. To put it bluntly, it was because the Sword Sect did not have the ability to deal with Xietian's group. But why did the Sword Sect not have the ability to deal with them? Even if the Sword Sect was attacking the shrines, it was impossible for them to send out all their experts. Moreover, Xiao Chun and Jun Wuya did not participate in the Battle of the Shrines. But Xiao Chun and Jun Wuya did not appear, but that did not mean they were in the Sword Sect. Xietian had thought too much from the beginning. Xiao Chun might have thought that he would interfere in the Battle of the Shrines, so he had secretly brought people to the Divine Continent, one in the open and one in the dark, waiting for him to be caught in the Divine Continent. So the Sword Sect did not have that many guards, not to mention stopping him. The Sword Sect definitely did not think that he would suddenly appear in Sword City. From the beginning, Xiao Chun had thought that he would appear in the shrines, so the Sword Sect must be in a panic right now. Doing this was just to stall for time, waiting for Xiao Chun to come back. Everything had been thought through. Regarding this, Xietian was speechless. This was definitely the best chance for him, but he had wasted all this time. If he had realized this problem from the start, he would have attacked the Sword Sect without caring about anything else. Perhaps he would have succeeded in breaking through the Sword Sect by now. After all, there weren't any experts guarding the Sword Sect right now, and even if there were, there wouldn't be that many, so it was impossible for them to block his attacks. However, from beginning to end, Xietian had been cautious. After wasting all this time, he didn't know where Xiao Chun was right now. However, it was certain that Xiao Chun was on his way back. However, it would take some time for him to rush back to the Sword Sect from the Divine Prefecture. Even though Xiao Chun was an Ancestor Realm expert, it was impossible for him to accomplish this. There should still be time, so as long as he seized this chance and charged into the Sword Sect, taking down the Sword Sect before Xiao Chun returned and capturing Xiao Qin's family, it would be a complete victory. Xietian could only comfort himself like this. After all, he had wasted all this time, and Xietian's heart was filled with regret, but he couldn't turn back time. So, Xietian could only hope that he could take down the Sword Sect before Xiao Chun returned. Thinking of this, Xietian ignored the obstruction of the Sword Sect disciples and directly shouted, "Go to the Sword Sect, quickly." He was already too lazy to care about anything else. Xietian only had a single thought, which was to charge into the Sword Sect and take down the Sword Sect before Xiao Chun returned, capturing Xiao Qin's family. Hearing Xietian's words, the 1,000 martial artists no longer cared about the obstruction of the Sword Sect disciples. They focused on rushing to the Sword Sect, so their speed was naturally much faster. Sensing the movements of Xietian's group, the Sword Gate elders who were in charge of stalling for time all had serious expressions on their faces. However, there was no other way. They didn't have the ability to force Xietian's group to stay. They could only send the news back to the Sword Gate and inform the 100-Flower Fairy and the other girls. 100-Flower Fairy and the others who were still in the main hall of the Sword Sect quickly received the news from the elders. After they learned of the situation, their expressions were also very ugly. Because from Xietian's sudden change, it was clear that he had realized something, so he charged into the Sword Sect without caring about anything else. Perhaps Xietian had already guessed that the Sword Sect was an empty shell right now. Xiao Chun, Jun Wuya, and the other sword sect experts were not in the sword sect at all. If it was like this, then it would be very hard to stop them and stall for time, because Xietian would not be fooled again. It was already very hard to stall for time. Hunter Flower Fairy also spoke at this time. Activate the sect protecting array. There was no other way. They could only activate the sect protecting array. The sword sect protecting array was without a doubt much stronger than the blade sect, Moon Palace, and the other Ling Tian sects. Although it wasn't enough to stop Xietian's group, it could at least stall for time. With 100 Flower Fairy's words, the sword sect protecting array was activated. In just 15 minutes, Xietian's group appeared in the sky above the sword sect. Seeing that the sect protecting array had already been activated and the entire sword sect was covered in an array, Xietian was even more certain of his guess. Xiao Qin's group was definitely not in the sword sect. If Xiao Qian was in the sword sect, since he was already at their door, Xiao Qian would have no reason not to show himself. So, Xiao Qian had to be in the Divine Continent right now. This was a complete coincidence. Xietian never thought that Xiao Qian would think of ambushing him in the Divine Continent, but there was no doubt that this gave Xietian a perfect chance. So without another word, Xietian directly made his move and prepared to break the array. He didn't have time to waste right now and had to race against time. He had to break the sword sect protecting array before Xiao Qian appeared. Using all their strength, including the 1,000 martial artists under Xietian, they also used all their strength to attack the array. For a while, the sword sect protecting array began to tremble under the attacks of Xietian and the others. It seemed like it could break at any moment. This array clearly couldn't last for long. Outside the main hall, looking at the crumbling array, 100 Flower Fairy softly spoke. Shui Rou, if the array breaks, bring Xiao Lao, Xiao Yao, and the others away. If the array was broken, if Xiao Qian didn't arrive in time, there was no need to talk about the result. So, 100 Flower Fairy had Qin Shiru prepare to leave at any time. As for how to leave, they could just use the transfer array. Hearing 100 Flower Fairy's words, Qin Shiru's expression became ugly, but he didn't refuse. He knew 100 Flower Fairy's meaning. He definitely couldn't let Xiao Yao, Xiao Lao, and Xiao Qing fall into Xietian's hands. Otherwise, Xiao Qian would be in a very passive position. But as soon as 100 Flower Fairy's voice fell, and before the array could break, a giant pressure appeared in the sky. With this pressure, Xiao Qian's figure appeared in front of Xietian. Facing Xietian's fist that was attacking the array, Xiao Qian also sent out a fist, and the two of them clashed. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. This chapter ends. Chapter 2651. Xiao Qin's sudden appearance stunned Xietian. At the same time, it also stunned Qin Shu, 100 Flower Fairy, and the other girls outside the main hall. Only when the two of them clashed did everyone come back to their senses. Xiao Qin's sudden appearance stunned Xietian. At the same time, it also stunned Qin Shu, 100 Flower Fairy, and the other girls outside the main hall. Only when the two of them clashed did everyone come back to their senses. Qin Shu and the other girls were naturally pleasantly surprised, but Xietian's face sunk. He was about to break the sword sect protecting array, but Xiao Qian had actually returned at this time. If he had another 15 minutes, Xietian was certain he could capture Qin Shu and the others alive. As long as he had Xiao Qian's family in his hands, even if he was surrounded by the sword sect, Xietian wouldn't be afraid. This was because Xietian was very clear that with Xiao Qian's personality, it was impossible for him to give up on his family. At that time, if he used Xiao Qian's family as a threat, he would definitely be able to make Xiao Qian submit. But it was a pity that all of this was impossible now. Xiao Qian's return made Xietian feel like all his efforts had been for naught. But this thought only lasted for an instant before it was thrown to the back of Xietian's mind. This was because Xietian found that Xiao Qian seemed to be alone. Jun Huiya, Long Qing, Xian Yuan Ling, and the other sword sect masters didn't seem to be here at all. Xietian even secretly sensed his surroundings and confirmed that there was only Xiao Chun around and no one was lying in ambush. For a moment, Xie Tian thought that Xiao Chun should have rushed back first, because Xin Yuanling, Long Qing, and the others were only Emperor Realm Masters. Their speed couldn't compare to Xiao Chen's. The sword sect situation was also very dangerous, so in a moment of desperation, Xiao Chun chose to rush back to the sword sect first. Xin Yuanling and the others were probably still on their way back. As for where Jun Wuyao was right now, it was hard to say, but one thing was certain, Jun Wuyao wasn't around right now. Thinking of this, Xie Tian's heart burned with passion. He had already missed a good opportunity, so Xie Tian couldn't make the same mistake a second time. Although Xiao Chen's timely return had ruined Xie Tian's previous plan, Xiao Chun was now alone and there weren't any other masters in the sword sect. If he didn't care about the cost, it was possible to kill Xiao Chun. He had more than 1,000 people under him and all of them had decent combat strength, so it was definitely possible. After all, even a tiger would find it difficult to fight a pack of wolves. No matter how strong Xiao Chun was, with everyone surrounding him and cooperating with him, would he have a chance to turn the tables? If he could directly kill Xiao Chun here, it would be the best news for Xie Tian. It would be even better than capturing Xiao Chen's family. Because as long as he killed Xiao Chun, the World Master of the Boundless World would be in his bag. Looking at the entire Boundless World, besides Xiao Chun, who else could compete with him? Moreover, without Xiao Chen's sword sect, could they still pose a threat to him? It was clearly impossible. They wouldn't pose a threat at all. Finally seizing the chance of Xiao Chun being alone, it was like Xie Tian had opened the door to a new world. The depression in his heart was swept away, and it was replaced with a strong joy and killing intent. This was the best chance to kill Xiao Chun. On the other side, seeing the change in Xie Tian's expression, although all of this took a long time to describe, it only took an instant. However, Xiao Chun had already guessed what Xie Tian was thinking. Moreover, he had to admit that there was no problem with Xie Tian's thoughts. At the same time, his current situation was very dangerous because Xin Yuanling and Long Qing were not here. This also meant that Xiao Chun needed to rely on his own strength to fight against Xie Tian and the 1,000 experts under him. This pressure could not be considered small. Xiao Chun was clear on his current dangerous situation, but Xie Tian did not give Xiao Chun much time to think. Time was still tight because he didn't know where Jun Wuyao was. So, Xie Tian did not hesitate at all as he directly made a move against Xiao Chun. He took the initiative to attack and roared out in a deep voice, "Attack together and kill Xiao Chun." He had already completely ignored the sword sect protecting array. Xie Tian was very determined to target Xiao Chun. As long as he killed Xiao Chun, even if he couldn't take down the sword sect, it would still be considered a great victory. Moreover, without Xiao Chun here, wouldn't the sword sect be in his hands? He could casually exterminate it when the time came. Just relying on Jun Wuyao alone, he couldn't support the entire sword sect. With Xie Tian's words, over 1,000 martial artists charged at Xiao Chun. Seeing this scene, Xiao Chun did not choose to run away. It wasn't that Xiao Chun didn't want to, and it wasn't that Xiao Chun was arrogant. Rather, it was because Xiao Chun had no other choice. Once he ran away, perhaps Xie Tian could not do anything to him, but Qin Shuru and the others would be in danger. It was certain that once he ran away, Xie Tian would not choose to chase after him and would continue targeting Qin Shuru and the others. Anyway, Xie Tian only had two choices. It was very simple. One was to kill Xiao Chun and the other was to capture Xiao Chen's family. If you don't run, I'll kill you at all costs. If you run, that's good. I'll capture your family. This was Xie Tian's current thought. So this was the reason why Xie Tian was this excited. It was because Xiao Chun did not have a chance of running away, or it could be said that Xie Tian was not afraid of Xiao Chun running away. Moreover, from the beginning, Xie Tian's attacks were clearly aimed at ending the battle as quickly as possible. He was attacking with the goal of exchanging injuries for injuries. Faced with Xiao Chun's attacks, Xie Tian could not dodge at all and choose to attack. Anyway, If you hurt me, I can also hurt you. Xie Tian was clearly not afraid of being injured. He had over 1,000 experts around him, and if Xiao Chun was injured at the same time as him, he would have the advantage, and Xiao Chun would not be able to exchange injuries with Xie Tian. But like this, Xiao Chen's hands were tied, and he could not fight Xie Tian at all. Adding in the fact that he had to defend against the 1,000 experts under Xie Tian. For a while, Xiao Chun was at a disadvantage as expected. Seeing the battle outside the array, Qin Shu and the others outside the main hall were filled with worry. They could naturally guess the current situation, which was that Xiao Chun was coming back alone. Xinyuan Ling, Long Qing, and the others should still be on their way back. Xie Tian had guessed this, so he attacked Xiao Chun without any hesitation, wanting to kill Xiao Chun in one fell swoop. Looking at the current situation, Xiao Chen's situation was not good, and he was clearly being suppressed. Without thinking too much, Qin Shu, 100-Flower Fairy, and the others immediately opened an opening in the array and moved to help Xiao Chun. With Xiao Chun coming back alone, Qin Shu and the others naturally couldn't do nothing. With the girls making a move, to a certain extent, it did reduce some of the pressure on Xiao Chun. Begging for collection, begging for votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 2652. Qin Shu, 100-Flower Fairy, and the others made a move, indeed helping to share some of the pressure on Xiao Chun. After all, the cultivations of these women had reached the Emperor realm. Facing them, Xie Tian's subordinates naturally couldn't ignore them. For a time, several Emperor realm cultivators had no choice but to engage in a fierce battle with these women. Qin Shu, 100-Flower Fairy, and the others made a move, indeed helping to share some of the pressure on Xiao Chun. After all, the cultivations of these women had reached the Emperor realm. Facing them, Xie Tian's subordinates naturally couldn't ignore them. For a time, several Emperor realm cultivators had no choice but to engage in a fierce battle with these women. The women made a move to support Xiao Chun, but although they helped, they couldn't change the situation too much because the pressure on Xiao Chun was still very big. Moreover, Xie Tian didn't care about these women at all and was still focused on killing Xiao Chun. Indeed, in Xie Tian's eyes, the importance of Xiao Chun surpassed that of Qin Shu and the others. As long as he could kill Xiao Chun, nothing else mattered. This was the only thought in Xie Tian's mind right now. He was determined to kill Xiao Chun here. In this regard, although Xiao Chun was bitterly holding on, as time passed, Xiao Chun's situation became worse. First were the injuries on his body. Under Xie Tian's reckless attacks, although Xiao Chun chose to dodge most of the time, there were always times when he couldn't dodge. At this time, Xiao Chun could only choose to take the attacks head-on. Although Xiao Chun had also injured Xie Tian, in a situation where both of them were injured, it was clear that Xie Tian had the advantage. After all, Xie Tian had so many subordinates, and Xiao Chun had given him a chance. The more he felt there was a chance to kill Xiao Chun, the more Xie Tian couldn't help becoming excited. His attacks became even more ruthless. Killing Xiao Chun, this could already be considered Xie Tian's obsession. Moreover, Xie Tian was very clear that he was pushed out by those old fellows from the Dark Era to become the world master of the boundless world because he still had a bit of use. However, once he failed, those old fellows from the Dark Era would give up on him without any hesitation. So, for Xie Tian, there was only one chance. If he failed, he would no longer have any value. He desperately wanted to kill Xiao Chun, and faced with the giant pressure Xie Tian gave him, Xiao Chun kept gritting his teeth. He didn't know when Xinyuan Ling and the others would arrive, but Jun Weia shouldn't take too long. After all, Jun Weia was also an Ancestor Realm expert, and his speed wasn't much slower than his. As long as he could hold on until Jun Weia arrived, the situation would be much better. Xiao Chen's only thought now was Jun Weia, holding on until Jun Weia arrived. Following this, under the gazes of all the disciples, this elder was the first to fly out of the array. Seeing this, all the disciples came back to their senses and followed behind. Their sect master was being surrounded. As a disciple of the sword sect, how could they just stand by and watch? Even if their cultivations were low, there was no reason for them to be afraid. If they couldn't win, could it be they couldn't self-destruct? Seeing all the sword sect disciples fly out of the array, Xietian didn't care at all. These little fellows were as weak as ants in Xietian's eyes. He didn't put them in his eyes at all. In Xietian's eyes, these sword sect disciples couldn't even be considered cannon fodder. They didn't pose any threat at all. But very quickly, Xietian's view changed. Because even if these sword sect disciples were cannon fodder, Xietian had still underestimated their determination. The leading elder charged at Xietian. After being blocked by a Dao realm martial artist, this elder chose to self-destruct without any hesitation. Before he died, he revealed a wild smile. Sect Master, the sword sect's elder Zhao Lin has gone first. After saying this elder directly self-destructed. A terrifying spiritual energy storm directly swallowed this Dao realm martial artist. Seeing this, Xietian's brows jumped up. The sword sect's people also self-destructed, but what Xietian never thought was that after this elder self-destructed, the other sword sect disciples all chose to self-destruct. For a while, those Xietian subordinates that tried to stop the sword sect disciples were all swallowed by the spiritual energy storm, begging for collection, begging for votes, begging for recommendations. This chapter ends. Chapter 2654. Seeing the sword sect disciples explode one after another, Xietian's face instantly turned gloomy. These people that were ants in his eyes were actually self-destructing one by one without any fear of death. Seeing the sword sect disciples explode one after another, Xietian's face also turned gloomy. These people that were ants in his eyes were actually self-destructing one by one without any fear of death. However, the actions of the sword sect disciples did indeed create quite a bit of trouble for Xietian. Although the cultivations of these disciples were not high and could even be said to not be a threat, that was under normal circumstances. But now, these sword sect disciples did not have any intention of fighting and chose to self-destruct one by one. If it was just one or two of them, Xietian wouldn't care. After all, even if they self-destructed with the cultivation of these disciples, it wouldn't be much of a problem. Even if his subordinates fought them head-on, it wouldn't be much of a problem. But the problem was that the self-destructions in front of him were not just one or two sword sect disciples, but over 1,000 of them. Moreover, the number was still increasing. Without any hesitation or fear, these sword gate disciples chose to self-destruct as soon as they came forward. With so many people self-destructing, even if it was the 1,000 experts under Xietian's command, they would find it hard to resist for a while. This was the so-called ants can bite an elephant to death. The power of one disciple's self-destruction might not be much, but what about 2? What about 3? What about 10? What about 100? With so many of them, even if it was an end realm or an emperor realm master, they would still have to avoid them. With so many people self-destructing at the same time, Xietian's 1,000 subordinates were thrown into chaos. Seeing these sword sect disciples charging over without any fear of death, Xietian's face became more and more ugly. These fellows simply didn't know life from death, but Xietian didn't have any good methods to deal with this. On the other side, Qin Shiru and the other girls were also shocked when they saw this scene. This was their sword sect disciples. They had pride in their hearts. With the self-destructions of the sword sect disciples, there were some subtle changes in the situation. At least for now, Xietian's 1,000 subordinates didn't have time to worry about Shaochen. They had to pay attention to these sword sect disciples because many times, as long as one disciple successfully self-destructed, it would attract more sword sect disciples to self-destruct. They didn't dare let down their guard. Using this chance, Shaochen seemed to have obtained a breather. But this breather was exchanged for the sacrifice of the sword sect's disciples. Almost every second, there was a sword sect disciple falling. Although Xiao Chun was alone, seeing Xiao Chen's back, the disciples didn't know why, but they felt a strange sense of security. It was as if as long as Xiao Chen was here, they would be absolutely safe. Their sect master would not let anything happen to them and would definitely protect them all. Seeing Xiao Chun block his attack, Xie Tian said in a cold voice, "Xiao Chun, you don't need to bluff. You are already an arrow at the end of its flight, and there are no experts in the sword sect. Today, I will definitely kill you and flatten the sword sect. Come and try. I alone am enough." Hearing this, Xiao Chun said in a very calm voice. After saying this, without waiting for Xie Tian to speak, Xiao Chun actually took the initiative to attack. Taking a step forward, he instantly appeared in front of Xie Tian and stabbed out with his sword. The sharp sword stabbed out at Xie Tian like lightning. Facing Xiao Chen's attack, Xie Tian did not dare be careless. He attacked while angrily roaring out, "Kill for me. No matter the price, you must kill Xiao Chen here." Xie Tian was very clear that this was the best chance to kill Xiao Chun. The fierce battle from before had already consumed a lot of Xiao Chen's spiritual energy and physical strength. Moreover, the injuries on his body were not light. If he couldn't kill Xiao Chun in this situation, it would be even more difficult in the future. So, Xie Tian was not willing to give up. Even if Xiao Chun had broken through to the small success ancestor realm, he swore to kill Xiao Chun here. He already did not care about the fall of his subordinates. Seeing his subordinates being killed by Xiao Chun one by one, Xie Tian's expression did not change. This was because with each person Xiao Chun killed, Xiao Chen's injuries would become more serious. If this continued, Xiao Chun would be exhausted to death. Only he did not know where the other experts of the sword sect were. But no matter what, the most important thing was to kill Xiao Chun as soon as possible. Xie Tian himself was not afraid of death, and Xiao Chun was even more so. Being surrounded by everyone, Xiao Chun was like a tiger surrounded by wolves. Although he was surrounded, he was still incomparably fierce. There were already no less than 20 experts under Xie Tian that had fallen under Xiao Chen's sword. But it was like Xie Tian had thought. Xiao Chen's injuries were indeed becoming more and more serious as time passed and the battle continued. Xie Tian was certain that Xiao Chun was forcefully holding on. As long as he broke through this threshold and made Xiao Chun unable to fight, it would be easy to kill Xiao Chun. So, even if Xiao Chun had already killed all these subordinates, Xie Tian did not have any intention of giving up. He still wildly attacked Xiao Chun. Fighting until now, even Xie Tian had to admit that Xiao Chen's battle strength was terrifying. It was like he was fighting his group by himself. Chapter 2657. Xiao Chun had indeed consumed a lot of energy and was gasping for breath at this moment. But Xiao Chun definitely wouldn't believe Xie Tian's words. Was it possible to pretend that nothing had happened before? Not to mention whether Xiao Chun believed it or not. Even Xie Tian would not believe this. This was indeed the case. The reason Xie Tian said this was to make Xiao Chun lower his guard from the beginning. Don't look at how Xiao Chun looked like a lamp that had run out of oil. If Xiao Chun went all out to resist, Xie Tian really wouldn't be able to take down Xiao Chun easily. Moreover, time was very important to Xie Tian. So Xie Tian said these words. Of course, Xie Tian didn't want Xiao Chun to believe him. After all, Xiao Chun wasn't that stupid. He just said these words to make Xiao Chun lower his guard a little, while Xie Tian looked for an opportunity to launch a sneak attack. After fighting for so long, Xiao Chun was indeed an arrow at the end of its flight. So the next step was to find a way to deal him a fatal blow. As soon as Xie Tian's voice fell, Xiao Chun looked at Xie Tian indifferently and said with a sneer, "As long as I'm here, you won't succeed today." Xiao Chun didn't care about Xie Tian's words at all. Xie Tian remained expressionless, but the Emperor Realm cultivators beside him directly attacked without any warning. Several of them attacked at the same time, attacking Xiao Chun at the same time. If it was any other time, facing the attacks of these Emperor Realm masters, even if they joined forces, Xiao Chun wouldn't care much, but it was different now. Xiao Chun was already seriously injured, so facing the attacks of several Emperor Realm masters, Xiao Chun naturally didn't dare to be careless. He immediately counterattacked, blocking their attacks one by one. However, just as Xiao Chun blocked their attacks, Xie Tian, who hadn't made a move until now, keenly grasped Xiao Chun's weakness and directly attacked, sending a punch toward Xiao Chun's chest. All along, Xie Tian had been looking for an opportunity to deal a fatal blow to Xiao Chun, and the attacks of those Emperor Realm masters just now were to attract Xiao Chun's attention. If it was any other time, Xiao Chun definitely wouldn't reveal such a flaw, but now, because of his injuries and large consumption of energy, Xiao Chun's combat strength obviously couldn't be compared to when he was at his peak. As a result, Xiao Chun's movements and reactions were naturally half a beat slower than usual. It was because this short moment of weakness was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Xie Tian, and Xie Tian had indeed accurately grasped this opportunity. As Xie Tian punched out, Xiao Chun clearly had no way of dodging. If this attack hit Xiao Chun, even if it didn't, it would probably add to his injuries, and it would be enough to cause Xiao Chun to lose his ability to fight. The fierce attack didn't give Xiao Chun the slightest chance.